Hello, fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. MrBallen here. By now, you may already know about my other podcast called MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where I tell, you guessed it, medical mysteries. Well, today, on this podcast, I'm going to share with you one of my favorite episodes from my medical mystery show. It's called The Curse of Veneto, and it's got one heck of an ending. It's about a family in Italy that for centuries is hit with one tragedy after another. Now, local legend suggests that this family was cursed, which seemed like sort of a catch-all way of saying the family was just very unlucky. However, by the end of this nightmarish episode, you might actually believe that this family really was cursed. If you enjoy today's special medical mystery episode, well, you're in luck because you can go binge dozens and dozens more medical mysteries right now for free. Just look up MrBallen's Medical Mysteries wherever you get your podcasts, and boom, you're in. Also, if you want, you can listen to MrBallen's Medical Mysteries early and ad-free on Amazon Music, or by joining Wondery Plus in the Wondery app, or on Apple Podcasts. Okay, enjoy the story. In the summer of 1983, a middle-aged Italian man held his mother's hands as they swayed about on a dance floor. His mother was in her 90s and was not able to get out very much, so this was an extremely special occasion. And this particular dance floor was on a cruise ship sailing on the Mediterranean Sea. It was an unbelievable experience he knew they would never forget. Then a slow song came on, and as they danced together, the man began to feel abnormally hot. Sweat ran down his chest and underneath his tuxedo jacket, his hair stuck to his neck, and when he touched his forehead, his hand came away wet. He told his mother he'd be right back, and then he left the dance floor, took off his jacket, and walked to the cruise deck, hoping the ocean breeze would cool him down. But when he got up there, he didn't cool down, and instead he just kept on sweating until his dress shirt was completely drenched. The man finally just ran to a bathroom in one of the cruise ship's long hallways, and he ran right over to the sink, turned on the cold water, and splashed it on his face. But when he looked up at his reflection, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Not because of how much he was sweating, but because when he looked at his eyes, he could see his pupils had shrunk to 2 tiny pinpricks. Suddenly, he knew exactly what was wrong. He stared at his sweaty reflection and told himself he would go back out there on the dance floor and he would enjoy this night with his mother. He had to make every second count, because he was certain he'd be dead within a year. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm MrBallen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please take the follow button on a 70-hour cross-country road trip and insist on only listening to Christmas music the entire time. This episode is called The Curse of Veneto. On a spring evening in 1978, a 48-year-old man named Silvano walked through the doors of a grand Italian palazzo. Silvano was in this big, gorgeous house to celebrate someone's birthday, though he wasn't exactly sure whose birthday it was. This wasn't unusual for Silvano. He came from one of the most prominent families in the Veneto region, so his calendar was often packed with all kinds of galas and parties and charity events. And he never passed up an opportunity to slick back his bright red hair and dress in his favorite tuxedo. As Silvano made his way to the bar, he noticed people looking at him and whispering to each other. He tried not to pay any mind to it. Everyone in his family was the subject of gossip and rumors. It was something he'd grown up with his entire life. So Silvano ignored the chatter while he got his drink and then went to join some friends. While they talked, he caught the eye of a beautiful woman across the room. And instead of turning away or whispering to her friends, the woman smiled. Silvano smiled back. He'd always had a lot of success with dating, and he loved the bachelor lifestyle. So he excused himself from his friends and began walking in the woman's direction. But before he reached her, somebody grabbed his arm. Silvano turned to see who it was, and he saw it was his niece's husband, Ignazio. And he was out of breath, his hair was a mess, and his clothes were totally disheveled. And he told Silvano that something was terribly wrong with Silvano's sister. Silvano kept a calm expression on his face, but inside he was panicking because he knew exactly what was wrong with his sister. He told Ignazio to bring him to his sister right away, and the two men hurried off out of the party. About half an hour later, Silvano was by his sister's bedside, and she was curled up in her pajamas, totally drenched in sweat. Silvano bent down to ask how she was feeling, and when she turned to look at him, her pupils were so small he could barely see them. She stared in his direction for a moment, and then just shook her head. Tears slowly filled Silvano's eyes. He knew what that look meant. His sister had been struck by the family curse. A few months later, in early 1979, Silvano and the rest of his family stood at his sister's grave for her funeral. His mother gripped his arm, sobbing into his chest, while the priest performed the eulogy. Silvano was stricken with grief as well, but now his eyes were dry. He felt like he'd been mourning his sister ever since that night when he found out she was sick. He just didn't have any more tears to cry. He held tightly onto his mother, doing his best to offer her comfort. He whispered to her that there was nothing anyone could have done. After all, nobody survives the family curse. At this, Silvano's mother snapped her head up, glaring at him with red-rimmed eyes. She hissed at him to never speak of that again. Otherwise, he, Silvano, could be struck by this curse that had just killed his sister and had killed his father, his grandfather, and countless other relatives dating all the way back to the 1700s. Silvano apologized and his mother nodded, and then she nestled her head back into his chest. Silvano spent the rest of the funeral in stoic silence. As his sister's casket was lowered into the ground, Silvano couldn't help picturing what his own funeral would look like when this curse inevitably killed him. After his sister died, Silvano threw himself completely into his work. He managed a very successful construction company and spent all his time organizing projects and visiting job sites. One of his remaining living sisters, who lived with Silvano, had to constantly remind him to eat and drink, and then whenever he had a social event, she had to remind him to attend it. For the next few years, that was what Silvano's life was like. Basically work 24/7. But by 1983, 4 years after his sister had died, Silvano was completely exhausted. He knew he needed a break. So that summer, he decided to surprise his mother with a cruise on the Mediterranean Sea. And it would turn out it would be just what he needed. The warm air was invigorating, and every evening there was a new party for Silvano to attend. But on the last night of the cruise, disaster struck. Silvano was dancing with his mother when he suddenly felt overheated. He could feel his skin sticking to the shirt underneath his tuxedo jacket. His mother pulled away from him and asked if he was okay, and Silvano nodded and said he was fine, he just needed to go cool off for a minute. Silvano's pulse raced as he ran to the bathroom. He knew this was not just a simple case of overexerting himself, and when he looked into the mirror, his pinprick-sized pupils confirmed his worst fear. The family curse had indeed come for him too, and he was all too familiar with what happened next. First, he would stop being able to sleep, his mind would begin to deteriorate, and he'd lose his grip on reality, and then shortly after that, he'd be dead. And there was nothing anyone could do about it. After the cruise was over, Silvano considered telling his mother and sister that he very likely had been afflicted by the family curse, but ultimately he decided against it. There was nothing they could do to stop this curse from killing him, and so he just didn't want them to worry. But it was very difficult for Silvano to hide his symptoms from his family, especially his sister who lived with him. He kept having to change clothes because he sweated through them so quickly. He rarely made eye contact with her because he didn't want her to see his pupils, and at night when he laid in bed unable to sleep, he was too scared to get out of his bed and do anything because he was worried his sister would hear him walking around. About 6 months after the cruise, Silvano sat at his desk in his home office. He'd been avoiding going to work in person because he didn't want anyone to notice his illness. The clock read 3 p.m., but Silvano had already put in a long day because he had been up working since 4 o'clock that morning. Even though he'd been working for 11 hours straight, Silvano did not feel tired. He just felt hot. He grabbed a piece of paper off his desk and used it to fan himself. Silvano knew the curse was only going to get worse, but there really wasn't anything he could do to stop it. So he figured, why worry about it? He didn't even call a doctor. He'd rather keep trying to live his life than cry over something he couldn't change. Just then, Silvano's sister rounded the corner into his office. He immediately dropped the paper, hoping she had not noticed him fanning himself, and she asked if he was going to take a break to eat. But he told her he was just too busy. She stood there staring at him. He could tell she didn't believe him. Finally, she sighed and left the room. For a second, Silvano thought about getting up and following her down the hall and letting her in on his declining health, but before he could, his phone rang, so he answered it. It was his niece's husband, Ignacio. He asked Silvano if he'd come over for dinner that evening. Silvano didn't have any other plans, so he said sure. Silvano hung up the phone and pushed the stack of papers aside and then stood up. He'd already sweat through all of his clothes, so he'd need to shower and change. He quietly opened his office door and tiptoed to his bedroom, being extra careful not to make any noise, in fear that his sister might come find him and see his drenched clothing. Silvano hated having to sneak through the house, but he didn't know what else to do. He promised himself that he would tell his sister what was going on as soon as he could find the right words. That evening, Silvano arrived at Ignacio and his niece Elisabeta's house with his red hair neatly brushed and a pocket square tucked into his suit. Silvano shook Ignacio's hand and gave Elisabeta a hug. He kept a smile on his face, but as he did, he worried they would see how sweaty he already was. As they led him down the hallway to the kitchen, Silvano caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror, and he looked terrible. He'd done everything he could to clean up, but there was just no hiding the sweat on his brow or the dark circles under his eyes or his tiny, tiny pupils. Silvano looked away from his reflection and took a seat at the table. Ignacio filled 3 glasses with red wine, and Elisabeta brought a large dinner salad to the table. Silvano had barely taken 1 bite before Ignacio made him wish he had not come over at all. Ignacio asked Silvano how he'd been sleeping. Silvano knew exactly what that meant. Either he had not hidden his symptoms well enough, or maybe his sister, who lived with him, maybe she noticed the curse was creeping up on him and told the family. Silvano sipped his wine and admitted he had not been sleeping much. But it was okay. He was using the extra time to get more work done. The only thing that bothered him was that his sex drive had disappeared. He said that to be funny, but Ignacio and Elisabeta did not laugh. Ignacio's expression was grave. He said he'd gotten access to the local parish records, which contained information about the family going back to the 18th century. He discovered that throughout the generations, Silvano's ancestors had frequently died young, and the records said they died from all kinds of strange disorders and diseases. Things like epilepsy, fever, meningitis, dementia, various brain diseases, and schizophrenia. As for the death of Silvano's sister, that had been attributed to familial encephalitis, which is a type of brain disease. But Ignacio said he didn't think any of those things were actually the thing that killed them. He was certain they had all died from the family curse. But of course, family curse would not be an acceptable cause of death. Even in the 1700s, they would not put that down as the thing that killed someone. Ignacio believed the real disease that was wiping out members of this family was some kind of rare genetic condition originating in the brain, one that nobody had ever been able to identify. He begged Silvano to please seek help from a neurologist before it was too late. Silvano leaned back and crossed his arms. He felt betrayed, like this dinner had been a setup just to ambush him. He told Ignacio he didn't want help. He'd seen his sisters poked and prodded by doctors before invariably they still just passed away. Going to a neurologist would only cause more pain and more frustration. But Ignacio would not take no for an answer. He said he knew a neurologist in a nearby town, it'd be a quick visit, and if nothing else, the doctor might be able to prescribe something that could help Silvano sleep even a little bit. Silvano shrugged and then finished his wine in a single gulp, and then he said, "Okay, fine, I'll go, but only if you don't ask me to do anything else after this." A few days later, Silvano sat in the passenger seat of Ignacio's car as they drove on the thin roads of the Veneto region, passing by fields of grazing cattle, intricate Gothic buildings, and canals full of clear water. The view was beautiful, but Silvano was too anxious to enjoy it. He did not believe this neurologist was going to be able to help him, but there was still a part of him deep down that did hope he could be cured. They pulled up to the neurologist's office, parked, and walked inside. While they checked in with the receptionist, Silvano felt like he was being watched by the other patients in the waiting room. As usual, Silvano tried to ignore their curious looks, but now it was harder for him to do. His family's curse and the trail of early deaths left behind was an open secret within this community. He could sense them evaluating him to see if he might be suffering from this curse too. After a few uncomfortable minutes in the waiting area, Silvano and Ignazio were called back to an exam room. A young neurologist came in, and Silvano explained his symptoms: unusual sweating, tiny pupils, low sex drive, and difficulty sleeping. Silvano was on edge as he watched the neurologist think. The doctor said he wasn't sure what to make of the sweating and the size of Silvano's pupils, but the lack of sleep could be a result of anxiety or depression. The neurologist prescribed Silvano a sedative. He said it might not cure him, but it should help him rest. Just like that, Silvano's hope dissolved. He'd known this appointment would be useless. Feeling disappointed, he stood up and thanked the doctor, then he and Ignazio left the office and headed home. The next evening, Ignazio was in his bed with his wife when his phone rang. He pushed the covers back and walked to the receiver, and when he picked it up, he heard Silvano's sister's frantic voice on the other end. She told Ignazio to come over quickly, then the line went dead. Ignazio figured this must have something to do with Silvano and the family curse, so he rushed to his car and sped over to his uncle-in-law's house. When he got there, he flung open the door and raced inside. Silvano's sister was right inside the house in the entryway, and her eyes were wide as she watched her brother, Silvano, who was right across from her at the base of the stairs. Silvano wore black silk pajamas that were totally drenched in sweat, and he was hunched over slightly, moving his arms like he was trying to pick up objects and move them, except his hands were empty. It was like he wasn't even aware of what he was doing or aware of anyone else in the room. Silvano's sister whispered to Ignazio that she'd heard a commotion in Silvano's room, and when she went to investigate, she saw Silvano sitting up in bed doing this weird military-style salute. And then without a word, he'd just gotten up, walked right past her, and marched down the stairs. And so Silvano's sister had no idea what was happening or what to do. Ignazio reassured her that probably Silvano was just sleepwalking and so was not in any sort of danger. Then Ignazio walked over to his uncle-in-law and he kind of shook his shoulder, at which point Silvano woke up, acted very confused, and then said he'd been dreaming about packing a suitcase. Ignazio glanced from Silvano to Silvano's sister, and then he told both of them that, it seems like the sedative Silvano is taking is probably leading to sleepwalking. And so because sleepwalking can be quite hazardous, it's probably best that Silvano stop taking the sedative. Ignazio was naturally very worried about Silvano. Even though the first neurologist really had not worked out at all, Ignazio felt even more determined to find someone who could maybe help Silvano get better. But while Ignazio looked for another doctor, Silvano's symptoms just got worse and worse. He had not been sleeping well for months, and the exhaustion was totally getting to him. In March of 1984, so about a month after the sleepwalking episode, Silvano tried to go into the office to work. He wore cool, comfortable clothing and acted like everything was perfectly normal. But when one of his employees asked him a very simple question, it was like Silvano's brain couldn't process it, and so he literally couldn't answer. And then later, when Silvano tried to just write his name on a document, his hands were so shaky that his signature looked totally wrong. And a few times he tried to speak to his colleagues, and the words came out slurred and totally incoherent. Silvano knew he could not continue to work like this. As much as he wanted to cling to his normal life, he knew his normal life was over. So he walked into his boss's office and quit his job. As he packed up his belongings, Silvano had to face the facts. He was dying. It was heartbreaking and infuriating to know that he would succumb to the same illness that had been killing his family for centuries. But Silvano had changed his mind about one thing. He knew he was going to die, but he didn't just want to wait for death. Instead, he wanted to do everything he could to try to learn about his illness, and so that maybe he could prevent other family members from getting this family curse. Silvano hated the idea of seeing another doctor, but now he needed one. He went home that afternoon and called Ignazio, and to Silvano's relief, Ignazio said he'd actually already found the perfect neurologist. The next morning, a renowned sleep expert named Dr. Elio Lugarezzi welcomed Ignazio and Silvano to the University of Bologna's Neurological Institute in the bustling city of Bologna, Italy. Dr. Lugarezzi greeted Ignazio and then went to shake Silvano's hand, but Silvano for a second just stood there staring blankly like he didn't understand what was going on, and then suddenly he kind of snapped out of it and reached out and shook the doctor's hand. After that, Dr. Lugarezzi led the men down a long decorated hallway into his office. The doctor sat at a large organized desk and motioned for Ignazio and Silvano to take the seats across from him. Then, once they were seated, he asked Silvano what was going on. In an eerily calm and quiet voice, Silvano said he was going to die, and he knew exactly how it was going to happen. Currently, he said he was having trouble sleeping, but he was still getting maybe 2 or 3 hours of rest every night. But eventually he knew he would stop sleeping altogether, and then he would develop hallucinations, and then eventually the exhaustion would kill him. Ignazio leaned forward and explained that Silvano's illness actually ran in his family. 2 of Silvano's sisters had died from this condition, so had his father, grandfather, and various ancestors going back more than 2 centuries. Dr. Lugarezzi eyed Silvano carefully. He'd been studying sleep for over 20 years, and he'd never heard of any condition like this. But Dr. Lugarezzi was very confident in his abilities as a sleep specialist, and so he assured Silvano they could find a treatment. But Silvano just shook his head and said there really was no treatment. However, even though he knew he was doomed, he wanted to try to help his family as best as he could. And so he asked Dr. Lugarezzi to please study him until he died, and then after he died, take his brain and study it and try to figure out what this curse really is. Dr. Lugarezzi stared at Silvano and then glanced over at Ignazio, who looked just as desperate as Silvano, and then the neurologist just nodded. He told Silvano to go home, pack up everything he needed to live at the Neurological Institute, and then come back that evening. And then, after Silvano and Ignazio left, Dr. Lugarezzi and his team set up the laboratory observation room where Silvano would live. The room was small and nondescript, and had a bed in one corner and a video camera in the other. The video camera would allow doctors to record Silvano's every move. Hopefully, this would allow them to figure out what Silvano's illness really was, and who knows, maybe they might even be able to cure him. Silvano returned that evening wearing his black silk pajamas and carrying a suitcase that contained clothes and toiletries. As he stared at the building in front of him, he realized this was the place he was almost certainly going to die. Dr. Lugarezzi met Silvano at the door and led him back to the observation room where he'd be staying. Silvano sat at the edge of the bed while a team of neurologists hooked him up to all kinds of monitors. A sensor around his arm measured his blood pressure, a thin band on his other arm kept track of his body temperature, a piece of plastic clamped onto his finger counted his pulse. Lastly, Dr. Lugarezzi pulled out this sort of tight, stretchy hat and told Silvano to put it on. It looked kind of like a swim cap, except it was covered in small black circular sensors and cords. Silvano pulled it on, and 2 flaps of fabric hung down on either side of his face. As Dr. Lugarezzi velcroed the fabric together beneath Silvano's chin, he explained that Silvano was wearing an electrode sensor cap. It was there to track and record electrical signals in Silvano's brain, which would hopefully give Dr. Lugarezzi some insight into why he couldn't sleep. Silvano figured he looked absolutely ridiculous, but now was not the time to be concerned with his appearance. He was doing this to help his family. Dr. Lugarezzi told Silvano he would be constantly watching him and monitoring his vital signs. Then he turned and left, and Silvano was all alone in his new bedroom. Silvano laid down and closed his eyes. The oxygen monitor dug into his finger, and the electrode sensor cap pressed into the back of his head. He couldn't get comfortable, especially when he knew a camera was watching him. But it didn't really matter. Whether Silvano was here or at home, he didn't think he was going to get any sleep. So he laid on the bed and stared up at the tile ceiling. But the longer he looked, the fuzzier his vision got. And then the seemingly random patterns on the ceiling tiles started to morph and shift into shapes and faces. Silvano knew he was hallucinating, which came with the family curse, but he couldn't do anything about it, so he decided he would just enjoy the show. From outside the room, Dr. Lugarezzi watched a screen that showed data from Silvano's monitors. On the screen, a series of lines spiked, dipped, and flattened out, depending on the electrical signals in Silvano's brain. Dr. Lugaresi watched the screen, getting more and more confused. The data from Silvano's brain did not look like anything he had ever seen before. People typically had one electrical pattern when they were awake, and another quite different pattern when they were sleeping. But Silvano's results didn't match either of them. He was in some kind of in-between state, not awake, but not asleep. Dr. Lugaresi watched through the window as Silvano moved his arms up and down over his head. It looked like he was going through the motions of combing his hair, except his hands were empty and his head was totally covered in wires. Whatever was going on, it was not typical sleepwalking. Silvano would eventually fall asleep, but only for an hour. When he woke up, Dr. Lugaresi checked his various monitors. Silvano's body temperature was abnormally high, his breathing was irregular, and his heart rate was erratic. Dr. Lugaresi glanced at his colleagues, and they looked just as confused as he felt. Dr. Lugaresi didn't know what any of these symptoms meant or how they might be related. He realized that solving this mystery might be a lot harder than he'd anticipated. One morning, about a month into his stay at the Neurological Institute, Silvano sat upright in bed, staring into space. Over the past few weeks, his mind had begun to deteriorate. He spent almost all of his time in that in-between state where he wasn't quite sleeping or quite awake. Without regular sleep, every day kind of bled into the next one, and so Silvano lost track of time. He would look around the hospital room to try to ground himself to figure out what was going on, but he couldn't get his eyes to focus. Sometimes Silvano was vaguely aware of Dr. Lugaresi asking him some questions, but the doctor's voice sounded garbled and far away. That morning, as he sat awake staring at nothing, Silvano actually started to feel tired. And just as he thought he was finally going to get a little bit of sleep, his head just jerked right back up. And then he felt tired, and so he started to drift off, but then again, his head snapped back up. It was like his body was actively rejecting sleep. Frustrated, Silvano pushed himself out of bed with his weak, shaky arms, and then he just began shuffling around the room with no idea where he was trying to go or what he was trying to do. It took all of his strength to put one foot in front of the other, but it was better than trying to sleep unsuccessfully. As Dr. Lugaresi watched Silvano pace around in his room, the doctor decided he had to do something to help. He went into the room and gently led Silvano back over to his bed, and then once he was sitting down, he injected him with a sedative. And as soon as he did, Silvano's pulse and blood pressure plummeted. He almost stopped breathing. Dr. Lugaresi's stomach dropped. The sedatives had sent Silvano into a coma. Panicked, he administered more medications to undo the effect of the sedative, and these medications did bring Silvano out of the coma and put him back into that kind of trance-like state he was in. Dr. Lugaresi didn't know what to do. Silvano had always told him that there was no cure for this family curse, but Dr. Lugaresi had really wanted to prove him wrong. But now, after a month of monitoring Silvano, the doctor still could not give him a proper diagnosis, let alone help him get better. Dr. Lugaresi was really starting to feel helpless. Another month later, Dr. Lugaresi sat next to Silvano's bedside. Silvano was practically comatose, a totally blank expression on his face, until out of nowhere, he wrapped his arms around his legs and started screaming as loud as he could. To Dr. Lugaresi, it was like all of Silvano's pent-up pain and frustration was now finally just coming out. The worst part was, this seemed to be the last bit of energy left in Silvano. Over the next few weeks, Dr. Lugaresi watched as Silvano became less and less aware of the world around him. He quit eating, he quit moving, and so Dr. Lugaresi knew Silvano was dying, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Silvano passed away in the laboratory observation room. Just as he'd predicted, he died 9 months after that night on the cruise ship when he first noticed symptoms of the family curse developing. Dr. Lugaresi kept the promise he'd made to Silvano. Immediately after he died, a pathologist removed Silvano's brain, and it was shipped to a neurological specialist in America. And what that specialist discovered in Silvano's brain shocked Dr. Lugaresi. The thalamus is a small walnut-shaped structure located near the center of the brain. It helps us process sensory information and plays a vital role in consciousness and maintaining our regular sleeping and waking cycles. And Silvano's thalamus was full of holes. It literally looked like worms had just bored right through it. Large portions of his thalamus had just been totally destroyed. Dr. Lugaresi had never seen anything like this before. In fact, this was a new disease, and it would be named Fatal Familial Insomnia. In 1986, Dr. Lugaresi published his findings, detailing Silvano's illness and introducing his family's curse to the scientific community. Based on further research with Silvano's relatives, Dr. Lugaresi eventually determined fatal familial insomnia is caused by malfunctioning proteins which attack the thalamus. As the thalamus is destroyed, the brain loses the ability to regulate the body and the mind. This leads to total insomnia, like literally they cannot sleep anymore, which eventually causes death. The chances of the average person developing fatal insomnia are about 1 in a million. But in Silvano's family, where the disease had been passed down genetically through generations, the chances were 1 in 2. In 1986, Silvano and his relatives were the only known people suffering from fatal familial insomnia in the world. In the years since, researchers have found about 50 other families with the same disorder. There are currently no effective treatments for fatal familial insomnia. It's a death sentence. But doctors do still continue to research the disease in hopes of someday finding a cure. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, MrBallen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story, and also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Karis Allen Posh Cooper. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Andre Plus. Coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Teja Palakonda. Fact-checking was done by Bennett Logan. For Ballen Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt. Script editing is by Scott Allen and Evan Allen. Our coordinating producer is Matub Zaire. Executive producers are myself, MrBallen, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Senior producers are Loredana Palavoda and Dave Schilling. Senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Louis for Wondery. Hey, it's MrBallen here. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, then you should check out my other podcast, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries. Each week, I dive into some of the most bizarre, mind-bending medical stories you've ever heard. Cases that leave doctors scratching their heads, miraculous recoveries that defy logic, and strange medical mishaps that seem too wild to be real. These stories are more than just eerie. They are a reminder of how unpredictable and sometimes terrifying life can be. Up next is one of my recent favorites from the series. Whether you're new to MrBallen's Medical Mysteries or a longtime listener, I think you'll find it just as captivating as I did. If you like this content, make sure to follow MrBallen's Medical Mysteries on Amazon Music or wherever you get your podcasts. We put out new episodes every week, and each one dives into a bizarre, mind-bending medical mystery that will leave you questioning what you thought you knew about the human body. Early one morning, a concerned mother sat beside her young son inside of a hospital room. He was lying in the bed, curled into a ball, and he was drenched with sweat, and he was clutching his stomach. His doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with him, and until they did, they couldn't cure him. For now, all they could do was keep the boy hydrated and hope for a breakthrough. But, judging from how miserable her son looked, it didn't seem like the doctors were helping at all. The mother was starting to get worried that her little boy's life was in danger. The mother stood up to call the nurse when all of a sudden she felt dizzy and lightheaded. She sat back down and realized she was starting to sweat. A lot. This was exactly how her son's illness had started. Whatever he had, now she had it too. What she didn't know, though, was that thousands of other people were experiencing the same terrifying symptoms too. This was just the beginning of an outbreak that would spread across the entire United States. And there was no cure in sight. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm MrBallen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please offer to detail the follow button's car, but be sure to hide a slightly open can of tuna under their front seat. This episode is called Common Ground. On August 8th, 1998, Sharon Anderson's eyes shot open to the sound of her 8-year-old son's wailing. She glanced over at the bedside clock and saw it was only 4 a.m. Toby, her son, was a very deep sleeper, so she knew it had to be something serious to wake him up at this hour. So Sharon jumped out of bed and rushed down the hall to his room. Toby was still in his bed, and he was holding his belly with both hands. He was covered by a film of sweat, and he was moaning in pain. Sharon laid the back of her hand on Toby's forehead, and she found that he was burning hot. In fact, he felt much hotter than when he normally got sick. Sharon knew her son needed medical attention right now. She rushed back to her bedroom, woke up her husband, and told him to go get the car ready so they could drive their son to the emergency room. Then she ran back to Toby's room, she scooped him up in a blanket, and carried him down the hall. It was still dark out as Sharon and her husband loaded Toby into their car. Fortunately, the streets of Minneapolis were empty at that hour as they raced to the nearest hospital. Attending physician Dr. Jean Miller was just starting her shift when her office intercom buzzed and a voice announced that an 8-year-old boy named Toby had just been wheeled into the ER. His mother, Sharon, said Toby had been feverish for hours and was throwing up. Dr. Miller jumped up from her desk and dashed down the hall to the emergency room. She found Toby lying in bed, his eyes half open and his skin drained of color, while his pajamas were dark with sweat. The boy's parents hovered beside the bed looking worried and helpless. Dr. Miller called for a nurse to bring an IV saline drip to get some fluids into the boy. Then she measured his heartbeat and listened to his breathing. But the child's intense stomach pains suggested that whatever was going on was an intestinal issue. That covered a lot of possibilities, from food poisoning to something much more serious like appendicitis. Dr. Miller asked Toby's parents if he'd eaten anything unusual lately. They looked at each other and listed various meals from the past few days, but then said that nothing out of the ordinary came to mind. Dr. Miller nodded, then asked Toby where it hurt most. With very shaky hands, Toby pointed to his stomach. Tears formed in his eyes, and he told Dr. Miller the pain was getting even worse. Dr. Miller smiled calmly, doing her best to hide her concern that Toby seemed to be sinking. The doctor grabbed a phone off the wall and called the lab to order blood and stool samples. That would likely identify what was happening inside of Toby's body. The doctor was pretty sure it was some kind of food poisoning, but the boy's intense discomfort suggested that it could be more serious than your run-of-the-mill 24-hour stomach bug. Dr. Miller took the parents aside and told them to make a list of every food and every place that Toby had eaten in the past 4 days. Dr. Miller promised they would find out what was happening to their son and they would do everything in their power to make him right again. A few hours later, Dr. Miller's phone rang. It was the lab with Toby's results. They found blood in Toby's stool, which indicated intestinal bleeding, most likely from bacteria in his food. So Dr. Miller had apparently been right. It was some kind of food poisoning. Now they needed to figure out what kind of food poisoning it was. The lab technician said they had already isolated the bacteria from Toby's stool for closer analysis. Dr. Miller thanked the technician and hung up. The good news was that they were now closer to knowing what was making Toby sick. But the bad news was, until then, Dr. Miller could not really aggressively treat Toby's illness. For many bacterial infections, the best treatment is antibiotics, but with certain strains of bacteria, such as highly toxic strains of E. coli, antibiotics can actually make the patient sicker or even kill them. So for now, all Dr. Miller could do was keep Toby's fever down with medication and his dehydration at bay with an IV drip. Dr. Miller checked in with Toby's parents and told them to get some rest and that she would be back at the hospital first thing in the morning. Then the doctor left the room and went to the night nurse and told her to please contact her at home if anything changed with Toby. The next morning, Dr. Miller had just sat down behind her desk with a mug of coffee when a nurse knocked on the door and poked her head in. She said there was a new arrival to the ER, a 4-year-old girl named Peyton Egger. She had a sweltering 104-degree fever, and her mother said she'd been vomiting on and off for 12 hours with repeated bouts of diarrhea. Dr. Miller's mind raced as she followed the nurse down to the emergency department. White curtains were drawn all around a gurney that had just been wheeled in. Little Peyton was lying on the gurney, drenched in sweat. Her face was drained of color, and she was struggling to keep her eyes open, and her parents stood to the side, clutching each other nervously. Dr. Miller immediately ordered the nurses to hook Peyton up to an IV drip while she checked the girl's vitals. Peyton's pulse was weak, and her blood pressure was dropping. Dr. Miller worried she might be going into shock, which could cause her organs to shut down. Dr. Miller realized that Peyton's symptoms were very similar to Toby's, so much so that she wondered if both kids had caught the same infection. Peyton's parents told Dr. Miller that their home was in a suburb north of Minneapolis, which was nowhere near where Toby's family lived. Still, Dr. Miller thought there must be something these two kids had in common. Dr. Miller called the lab and told them she wanted full blood work run on Peyton, plus stool samples tested as well. Then, Dr. Miller took Peyton's parents into the hallway and asked them for more details. The mother said that Peyton had been complaining of stomach pains last night, but it really hadn't seemed that serious. But at around midnight, Peyton woke up crying from all the pain and then began vomiting. After that, she kept vomiting nearly every hour and had several episodes of severe diarrhea. Then her temperature started spiking. By dawn, the parents said it was clear that whatever this was, it was only getting worse. So her parents had rushed her to the hospital. Dr. Miller said they had done the right thing. Peyton would be safe here. For now, the best thing they could do was just stay calm and wait. But that was advice Dr. Miller found easier to give than to practice. As Dr. Miller stepped out of Peyton's room and headed back to her office, a nurse hurried up to her and said the lab had been trying to reach her. Toby's new results were in. The boy was infected with a bacteria called Shigella. Finally, Dr. Miller knew what she was up against. Shigella attacks the digestive system, causing inflammation and bleeding within 12 to 48 hours after eating food contaminated with the bacteria. Toby had all of the classic symptoms: fever, abdominal pain, nausea, diarrhea. Dr. Miller knew that if untreated, Shigella could send Toby into shock, which often leads to organ failure and occasionally even death. But at the same time, Dr. Miller was relieved. Although Shigella was obviously serious, it could be defeated with antibiotics, so she could finally start treating Toby. Dr. Miller told the attending nurse to prepare antibiotics for Toby and begin administering them as soon as they were ready. Then Dr. Miller rushed to Toby's room to give his parents the news. The boy was lying in his hospital bed with his eyes half open. His mother sat in a chair next to the bed, holding her son's hand and looking flushed and exhausted. Dr. Miller asked Toby's parents to step outside with her so she could explain what was going on. But when Toby's mother tried to stand up, she wobbled and had to sit back down. She admitted she had not been feeling well since she woke up that morning. She said she even vomited a couple of times. Dr. Miller told Toby's mother to stay seated while she called for a nurse to prepare a bed for her. The doctor told her it was entirely possible that she was also now infected with Shigella, which was the bacteria that they had just discovered her son was infected with. After all, Shigella is so contagious that it can be passed in a handshake if someone who touched the bacteria didn't wash their hands well enough. As soon as Dr. Miller had settled Toby's mother into her own hospital bed, a receptionist waved the doctor down. It was the lab calling again. They had the results for Dr. Miller's other young patient, Peyton. She had Shigella too. Dr. Miller put down the phone. First Toby, then maybe Toby's mother, and now Peyton? Suddenly, Dr. Miller felt like she had an outbreak on her hands, and given how easily Shigella is transmitted, there were likely dozens more people out there suffering symptoms at home, and every one of those cases could make more people sick. Suddenly, Dr. Miller had a lot of calls to make. Later on that same afternoon in August of 1998, a young epidemiologist at the Minnesota Department of Health named Dr. Julie Wickland was sitting at her desk when her secretary buzzed. She told her there was an urgent call coming in from a local hospital. Dr. Wickland was only in her 20s and still trying to prove herself professionally, but one thing she had already learned was that being an epidemiologist meant everything was a potential emergency. People's lives were always on the line. She picked up the phone and called Dr. Miller, who described the potential Shigella outbreak she was facing, 3 cases in her hospital, and likely a lot more people at home right now who just weren't sick enough to head to the hospital yet. But soon they would be. Once Dr. Wickland was done hearing from Dr. Miller, she requested to have Toby and Peyton's families fill out food history charts with everything they had eaten in the past 4 days. Then she met with her team at the Department of Health and assigned some of her best investigators to join her on this case. By the time she got back to her office, Dr. Wickland's secretary came in holding a stack of papers. The families had already filled out and faxed over their kids' food histories. Dr. Wickland spread them out on her desk and scanned them to look for commonalities. Right away, she noticed a pattern. They had all eaten at a restaurant called Roberta's. The odds were extremely low that both Toby and Peyton's families had eaten at the same place in the same 4-day window, especially considering how far apart they lived, and so this was exactly the type of breakthrough Dr. Wickland was hoping for. An hour later, Dr. Wickland and 2 other health officials stepped out of a dark sedan in front of the restaurant Roberta's, a modest neighborhood eatery. The manager was waiting for them by the entrance, looking very tense. The restaurant was temporarily closed for the rest of the day so that Dr. Wickland and her team could go and conduct their investigation there. Dr. Wickland needed to inspect every aspect of the restaurant's food handling for possible sources of contamination, such as spoiled food or dirty water. Dr. Wickland assigned one investigator to record the temperatures inside the refrigerators and freezers, while another investigator took water samples from all the sinks and taps. Then Dr. Wickland studied every step in the food's journey to the table, from the delivery area to the storage room to the food prep stations. The overall layout at Roberta's met safety standards, but Dr. Wickland knew how elusive Shigella could be. Shigella can show up almost anywhere and then can be spread by the people who are simply preparing the food. Dr. Wickland told the manager she needed to interview the entire staff. And so once the staff was gathered in the dining room, Dr. Wickland circled the room, asking each employee questions about their recent health and also their daily kitchen routine. Several members of the staff admitted to Dr. Wickland that they had not been feeling very good lately. Some had even been feverish and suffering pretty severe abdominal pains. It sounded worryingly similar to what Toby and Toby's mother and Peyton were all experiencing. Dr. Wickland then made copies of the restaurant's reservation list and credit card receipts from the past 4 days. Flipping through the pages, she estimated at least 400 people had eaten at Roberta's within a few days of when Dr. Miller's patients had eaten there. All of these diners were now at risk of getting Shigella. Back at the office, Dr. Wickland wrote up a questionnaire for all of Roberta's 400-plus diners. She needed to determine how many other customers out there were suffering similar symptoms. If any of them had contracted Shigella but didn't realize it, they could be infecting other people. These people needed to be notified right away, or else this situation could get much worse. The next morning, when Dr. Wickland arrived at her office, she learned that one of Roberta's employees had tested positive for Shigella. This confirmed that everyone who had eaten at the restaurant could now potentially be infected with the Shigella bacteria. But at least she now had a pretty good idea where the Shigella was coming from, a sick food prep worker who likely had not washed their hands properly. Dr. Wickland's first step was to call Roberta's and order the restaurant temporarily closed until the Shigella outbreak was totally contained. Then Dr. Wickland called Dr. Miller to get an update on her patients. Dr. Miller told her that Toby's mom was doing fine, but Toby and Peyton were struggling. Shigella is always harshest on the young and the elderly, and the children's conditions were not getting better. If they didn't start getting better soon, Dr. Miller feared they could go into shock and die. Early the next day, Dr. Wickland's phone rang with new results from the lab. Several more employees at Roberta's restaurant had tested positive for Shigella. This meant that the disease outbreak was not coming from a single unsanitary worker. It was coming from lots of places. Dr. Wickland got a fresh cup of coffee and then sat down at her desk to begin studying the first wave of questionnaire results from Roberta's recent customers. And she was disturbed to see that a full half of the 400 diners reported experiencing symptoms that were consistent with Shigella. But as Dr. Wickland studied the responses, something about the data just didn't seem right. A large percentage of infected diners had eaten at Roberta's before any of the employees started to get sick. So it was unlikely that the employees were giving the infection to the customers. The workers were actually victims too. Dr. Wickland leaned back in her chair and took a deep, defeated breath. She now realized that she actually had no idea where all the Shigella cases were coming from. An hour later, the manager at Roberta's unlocked the restaurant door and let in Dr. Wickland. She told the team to put on gloves and start discarding every piece of food in the building. Nothing could be saved. Roberta's manager was happy to comply, and Dr. Wickland told him the business could reopen once all the food had been thrown away and the entire restaurant professionally cleaned. They couldn't afford to take any chances. Dr. Wickland pulled a bin of produce off a shelf and dumped it in the trash. The Shigella was somewhere under this roof, and Dr. Wickland was not going to let it slip past her. Dr. Wickland returned to her office at the Department of Health to find a report sitting on her desk. Her heart sank. It was the details of another case of Shigella, this time north of Minneapolis. A 33-year-old woman had been rushed to a hospital after hours of vomiting, fever, and diarrhea. The night before, the woman had eaten at an upscale restaurant in her neighborhood called Marty's. Not only that, but she'd gone to the restaurant with multiple friends, all of whom had been contacted and reported feeling sick. But Marty's restaurant was very far from Roberta's. For this illness to strike two restaurants in entirely different areas, miles apart from one another, was extremely rare. Dr. Wickland sighed and called the manager at Marty's to tell them the restaurant would have to close until further notice. She said that a health official would be there shortly to collect their reservation list and credit card receipts, and all their recent diners would need to be contacted about the disease outbreak. Dr. Wickland then called a meeting with her investigators to brainstorm. She felt lucky that there had been no fatalities so far, but she also knew that young children were in the greatest danger. She told her team they had to find the link between Marty's restaurant and Roberta's restaurant that could explain all the Shigella cases. Maybe both restaurants sourced particular food items from the same place, or maybe an employee worked part-time at both restaurants, or maybe they shared a water supplier. Whatever it was, she told her team they had to go find out. By the next afternoon, Dr. Wickland had more information to go on. She and her team had worked around the clock, contacting people and compiling timelines of symptoms. It was a lot to sift through, but she knew it was always better to have too much information rather than not enough. As Dr. Wickland made her way through all the paper piled on her desk, the differences between the two restaurants really jumped out at her. Marty's got its water from a different reservoir than Roberta's, so this was not a water issue. There was also almost zero overlap in their menus because Roberta's and Marty's served very different types of food. And a review of the two restaurants' employees showed that no staff members worked in both places either. The researchers could not even identify a single food that all the sick customers at each restaurant had eaten. Everyone ordered different dishes, yet got sick the same way. And so Dr. Wickland wondered to herself, how could that be? This just doesn't seem possible. Just then, the phone rang. It was the lab with an update on the Marty's restaurant customers. everyone who tested had come back positive for Shigella. The lab had also done a genetic comparison of the Shigella bacteria from the Marty's diners and the Roberta's diners, and they found them to be identical. Clearly, both restaurants had been contaminated by the same source. Dr. Wickland thanked the technician and hung up. She felt stumped, exhausted, and ready to call it quits for the day, but she did have a couple more calls to make. The first one just to check up on Toby and Peyton. On the other end of the line, Dr. Miller sounded equally exhausted. She said Toby was still bedridden because his body was not responding to the antibiotics. He was now faced with a painful and slow recovery. Little Peyton Egger was even worse. Dr. Miller had nurses monitoring her around the clock, but her family was obviously worried sick. Dr. Wickland thanked her for the update, then she hung up and scrolled through her Rolodex until she found the United States Centers for Disease Control. This outbreak was clearly not settling down the way Dr. Wickland hoped it would, and so it was time to call in reinforcements. Dr. Timothy Niemi was in his office packing up to head home when his phone rang. He considered letting it go to voicemail, but his position as an epidemic intelligence officer at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention had taught him the danger of missing an emergency call. So he picked up the phone and he listened carefully as Dr. Wickland explained the events of the past week and how the Shigella outbreak showed no signs of slowing down. Dr. Wickland said she needed the CDC's help in finding the outbreak's origin so they could stop it. Every bacterial outbreak has its own genetic fingerprint that makes it unique, and the CDC keeps a massive database of these fingerprints from all over the world. Dr. Niemi told Dr. Wickland to email him an image of the Shigella bacteria's DNA profile. Then he could use the CDC's database to see if the same Shigella strain had been reported anywhere else. The moment Dr. Niemi uploaded the Shigella bacteria from Minnesota to his database, Shigella outbreaks in other areas popped up all over. From Los Angeles County to Boston to Florida, plus up in Canada, in Alberta and Ontario. Each outbreak had been linked to a specific restaurant, and all were genetically identical. This meant that there was a good chance all of these Shigella outbreaks were caused by the same source of contamination. The sheer breadth of locations baffled Dr. Niemi. He stared at the map. How did the same contaminant spread across both coasts, down to the Gulf of Mexico, and all the way up into Canada? He emailed his coworkers the results and asked them to help him contact every restaurant associated with an outbreak and compile a comprehensive list of foods and ingredients on their menus. There had to be something in common to all of them that was carrying this particular strain of Shigella. The next morning, one of Dr. Niemi's fellow investigators strolled into his office and handed him a Post-it note with one word written on it. Dr. Niemi read the note and couldn't help but laugh. The investigators had identified the probable source of the Shigella outbreak, and it was something that no one suspected. Dr. Niemi's department even had a term for this particular ingredient. They called it stealth food, because it's used in a wide variety of dishes, yet usually goes unnoticed. Dr. Niemi congratulated his team. This was the best lead they had. He picked up a phone and he called a colleague at the Food and Drug Administration named Jeremy Brown. Dr. Niemi told Jeremy what they had discovered and said he'd need the FDA's help tracing this particular ingredient, the stealth food, to the original supplier. Global supply chains for restaurants are incredibly complex, with foods shipping from across the world and constantly being reprocessed and repackaged, and so finding one bad batch of food among all of that would not be easy. Jeremy said he would get to work. A few days later, Jeremy rode in a Jeep through Ensenada, Mexico. At first, the countryside was dry and dusty, but as they curved over a hillside, suddenly everything turned green. For miles into the distance, Jeremy saw nothing but crops in organized rows. Finally, they turned onto a dirt road and passed a sign that said the name of the farm, Valle Verde. The farmhand pointed out different fields of produce, including tomatoes, celery, cilantro, green onions, radishes, and lettuces, all watered by massive irrigation machines. But the biggest spread of all was an entire 55-acre parcel devoted to growing nothing but the stealth food Jeremy had come to investigate. And the stealth food was parsley. At some point between when it was harvested and when it was shipped, this parsley was becoming contaminated with Shigella bacteria. Jeremy was not going to leave the farm until he found out where and how this was happening. The Jeep came to a stop on the banks of an old riverbed. Since tainted water is the most common cause of Shigella, Jeremy had requested to visit the farm's water supply first. The farmhand hopped out and led them to a series of wells that provided all of the farm's water. Jeremy looked inside one of them. The stone casing was old, but uncracked. The shaft was dug very deep, so that the water came from far underground, which meant the likelihood of contamination was actually quite small. Jeremy could tell the issue was not the wells. Next, the farmhand drove them past several meadows to a reservoir that served as the farm's backup water supply. It looked like a small fresh lake. The water seemed clean, but Jeremy still bottled up a couple of samples for testing back in the US. The farmhand asked Jeremy where he wanted to head next. Jeremy said he could use a break from the heat. It had gotten much hotter as the afternoon wore on. A few minutes later, the Jeep rumbled to a stop in front of a huge farm shed with a corrugated steel roof. It contained long conveyor belts stacked with crates of parsley. At the end of the line, men took those crates and stacked them on a pallet and then hosed them down with chilled water from a machine called a hydro cooler. Jeremy watched as hundreds of boxes quickly piled up and were loaded into the backs of huge trucks and then driven away to be shipped all across North America. Jeremy asked the farmhand if the water for the hydro cooler came from their wells or the reservoir, but the farmhand shook his head and said neither. The water for the hydro cooler came from Ensenada's municipal water supply. Jeremy put on his sunglasses and told the farmhand that that was where he needed to go next. At the municipal water plant, the facility's director admitted that they had been a bit overwhelmed lately. Due to government funding cutbacks, they had been understaffed for a while. With fewer security guards to watch the place, there had been a few break-ins lately, and some equipment had even been damaged. At one of the water filtration systems, Jeremy noticed that the machine that normally disinfects the water with chlorine was shut down. Jeremy asked the manager if the chlorinator had just been turned off today or if it really was not working at all. The manager shook his head in frustration and said this had been on their list to get fixed for over a month, but the city hadn't managed to send over the parts yet. Jeremy did his best to hide his shock. Without chlorine, all sorts of contaminants could flourish in the water, including Shigella. From there, the water was pumped to businesses, homes, and farms all over the area, like the parsley crop at Valle Verde. Jeremy filled several bottles to be tested and told the farmhand it was time to go. Days later, Jeremy got his results. Ensenada's municipal water was loaded with Shigella. And it was the same strain as the one found at Roberta's, Marty's, and all the other restaurants. The contaminated water had been sprayed directly onto the parsley right before being shipped to restaurants all across North America, where people like Toby, Peyton, and their families ate the parsley without giving it a second thought. Jeremy knew they had been lucky in tracking down the source relatively quickly. He estimated that as many as 1,000 diners had caught Shigella from one harvest of contaminated parsley, but it could have been so much worse. Fortunately, there were no fatalities, and both Toby and Peyton eventually made full recoveries. But very few of those who got sick will ever look at their parsley garnish the same way again. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, MrBallen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story. And also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Britt Brown. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Matthew Chaleli. Coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Tasia Palakonda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballen Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt. Script editing is by Scott Allen and Evan Allen. Our coordinating producer is Matub Zaire. Executive producers are myself, MrBallen, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Senior producers are Loredana Palavoda and Dave Schilling. Senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Louis for Wondery. Hey, it's MrBallen here. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, then you should check out my other podcast, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries. Each week, I dive into some of the most bizarre, mind-bending medical stories you've ever heard. Cases that leave doctors scratching their heads, miraculous recoveries that defy logic, and strange medical mishaps that seem too wild to be real. These stories are more than just eerie. They are a reminder of how unpredictable and sometimes terrifying life can be. Up next is one of my recent favorites from the series. Whether you're new to MrBallen's Medical Mysteries or a longtime listener, I think you'll find it just as captivating as I did. If you like this content, make sure to follow MrBallen's Medical Mysteries on Amazon Music or wherever you get your podcasts. We put out new episodes every week, and each one dives into a bizarre, mind-bending medical mystery that will leave you questioning what you thought you knew about the human body. In 1987, a woman walked into a public health center in Goiânia, Brazil, desperate for help. She was pale and weak, and she said a strange sickness was slowly killing her family. The official who saw the woman thought she was exaggerating, but just 24 hours later, he realized she was the key to solving one of the worst disasters in Brazil's history. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm MrBallen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you enjoy stories like this, please sign the follow button up for a cannonball competition in the Limpopo River. This week's story is called A Change in Fortune. On the hot evening of September 20th, 1987, 37-year-old Maria Ferreira hosted a lively family gathering at her small home in Goiânia, Brazil. Goiânia was a cosmopolitan city with nearly 1 million people. Gleaming skyscrapers and tropical fruit trees lined the wealthy downtown area. But there were also areas of extreme poverty. Maria and her husband, Davayer, lived in one of these lower-income neighborhoods where they owned and operated a scrapyard on their property. It was hard work, especially in the intense tropical heat. But Maria and Davayer made a great team. Maria liked to joke that even though Davayer was short and stocky, he always had his head in the clouds. Davayer would tease Maria when she took things too seriously, saying that that was why she had a gray streak in her long brown hair. But on this night, Maria was totally relaxed. There was plenty of delicious food and drink with people she loved, and they were able to pay for it because they had a little extra money from selling more scrap metal than usual. Maria and Davayer had also acquired a rare good luck charm a few days earlier. They never had much in the way of material possessions, but they tried to find beauty in their everyday life. This time, it was in a trinket Davayer had found. As they passed it around the table, she felt grateful for all the good fortune that had come their way. In the chair next to Maria, Davayer scooped a spoonful of black bean and pork stew onto his plate. He was listening to his brother, who was a bus driver, tell a story. He always had something funny to share from one of his routes. Davayer's other brother, Ivo, was there as well with his wife and their 6-year-old daughter, Lei Ji. The little girl's big brown eyes and joyful laugh filled Maria with love. Lei Ji was the closest thing she had had to a daughter since she didn't have any children of her own. It was the perfect night, and that called for a toast. Once everyone refilled their glasses, Maria raised hers in the air and thanked her family for coming. They all cheered and drank to the future. Later, after everyone left, Devier went into the garage to finish up some work. As Maria washed coffee cups and put away plates, she could hear thunder in the distance. The next morning, on September 21st, Maria woke to the sound of rain pelting her tin rooftop. Goiânia's rainy season normally ran from October to April, but this year it had started earlier than usual. As Maria climbed out of bed, she noticed that she didn't feel well. Her body was stiff and her stomach felt upset. She wrote off her discomfort to the previous night's festivities and tried to carry on with her day. But as time passed, Maria was starting to feel increasingly sick until finally, after a few hours, she started violently vomiting. Now, the pain in Maria's stomach was so bad that she decided she needed to see a doctor right away. She slowly got dressed and walked out to tell Devier. Maria found him working in the scrapyard. It was cluttered with old refrigerators, large pieces of sheet metal, and disassembled machines. Devier offered to take her, but she said she didn't want to distract him from his work, so she told him she could get there on her own. Maria took a bus to a nearby hospital and was able to see a doctor right away. After the doctor examined her, he said everything was fine. She must be having an allergic reaction to something she ate. Maria was relieved it wasn't something more serious. She found it hard to believe she could be this sick from food she was used to eating, but the doctor reassured her and said to go home and rest and she would feel better soon. But that evening, Maria still felt just as sick. She called her mom, who lived in a neighboring town, and asked her to come stay for a few days. Maria's mother took a bus there right away, and once she got there, she did her best to nurse her daughter back to health, feeding her broth and herbs, but whatever Maria had caught, it just wasn't going away. Even worse, Maria's mother soon started to feel sick too, with the same symptoms of fever and upset stomach that Maria had. So 2 days later, Maria's mom had to return back to her home to rest and recuperate as well. Maria was confused. If she was suffering from a food allergy like the doctor thought, why would her mom have gotten sick too? So now she thought maybe she'd come down with the flu and her mother had just caught it from her. So when her brother-in-law, Ivo, stopped by the house on September 24th, Maria tried to keep her distance from him. She'd been sick for 4 days and didn't want to risk passing anything on. Ivo didn't stay long at Maria and Devier's house, and soon he got back to his own home right in time for lunch. His wife had put out some egg sandwiches, and after Ivo and his wife had sat down to eat, they called in their daughter, Leiji, to come join them. But Leiji was having too much fun playing with her dolls, her glitter, and her coloring books. Finally, Leiji did abandon her toys and took her seat at the table with her parents. But just 10 minutes after eating, Leiji threw up. Then, later that afternoon, Ivo and his wife got sick too. At first, they thought it was the eggs they had for lunch, but Ivo soon realized this wasn't just a case of food poisoning. It seemed like almost everyone who had gone to the Ferreira household recently was getting sick. And by now, that included Devier, who was feeling nauseous, as well as his mother, who had come by to visit. The list grew to include 2 of Devier's brothers and a handful of their children. The sickness had even spread to several of the neighbors who had visited with Maria and Devier. 2 of Devier's scrapyard employees had also become ill, all in the span of a week. When Maria found out about the growing number of people who were getting sick, she was horrified, and she became even more afraid when she noticed something else very disturbing. There were these red lesions that were showing up on her skin that were painful to the touch. By September 27th, nearly a week after first getting sick, Maria's stomach pain was unbearable. As she lay curled up in bed listening to the rain falling outside, she thought back to that last night she felt healthy. It was the same night she had hosted the big family gathering. Maria tried to remember everything she had done that night. Then she realized something. There was only one thing that everyone who had gotten sick over the last 10 days had in common. Maria could barely move, but she knew what she had to do next. If she didn't get to the bottom of this mystery, her whole family could be in serious danger. And so, on the next morning, she willed herself out of bed and slowly managed to get dressed. Then she gathered the evidence she needed in a cloth sack. Maria knew where she wanted to take it, and it wasn't to the hospital where she'd been before. She was going somewhere that had the authority to help her. The only issue was, she needed someone to go with her. She was too exhausted to make the trip on her own. Devier wasn't feeling well enough to go with her, so she asked another scrapyard employee to accompany her. Maria let the young man carry the bag she'd packed. She was so weak she could barely keep moving. Just down the street, they boarded a crowded bus, and about a half hour later, they got off near an office called the Vigilancia Sanitaria. This was a public health agency that regulated pharmaceuticals, food products, and sanitary conditions. It was basically the Brazilian equivalent of the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. Maria thought that if anybody could figure out what was making her and her family so sick, it would be someone at this agency. She and her companion entered the plain brick building through a courtyard and were taken into the office belonging to the agency's director. The young man helping Maria dropped the bag he was carrying on the official's desk. Then Maria wiped her flushed face with a handkerchief and explained what it was. She said the contents of the bag were killing her family. The official just stared at her. He looked inside the bag and seemed confused. The items inside didn't look particularly dangerous. He said what really concerned him was Maria. Maria knew she was sweating and visibly shaking, and she noticed his expression as he looked at all the lesions and burn-like marks on her arms. The official told her that right now, she just needed to see a doctor, but he did promise he would take a closer look at what was in the bag. And, just to be safe, the official put the bag on a chair in the building's courtyard, then made sure Maria knew how to get to the nearest health clinic. Maria was skeptical. The last time she'd seen a doctor, he'd given her the wrong diagnosis, but she didn't know what else to do, so she and her companion left the agency and headed to the bus stop. Maria insisted that her companion return to the scrapyard and get back to work. Unsure and scared about what she would find out, Maria boarded the bus alone. A short time later, a doctor at this clinic carefully examined Maria and then gave her a new diagnosis. He said she was right. She was not experiencing an allergic reaction or food poisoning. What she had was a tropical disease, and her family and friends who were sick probably had it too. He explained that the unusually heavy rains had been spawning mosquitoes and a host of other bugs that carried infectious diseases. A virus like dengue or Zika would explain her symptoms, including the burn-like lesions she'd developed. The doctor assured Maria that this was all very manageable and that everything would be okay. Then he arranged to have her transported to the Tropical Diseases Hospital for specialized treatment. Maria's unease lightened, and she even managed a weak smile. She finally had a real explanation for what was happening to her and her family. It was a relief to think that the bag she had left at the health agency didn't actually have anything to do with a tropical virus. Less than an hour later, Maria arrived at the Tropical Diseases Hospital. As a doctor took her vitals, she asked if he knew what type of virus was going around. But instead of answering her question, the doctor gently took her arm and began closely examining her skin lesions. Then he called one of the nurses over to look at them. The nurse said she'd seen some other patients with similar burns in the last few days. Suddenly, the doctor's face turned serious, which made Maria extremely nervous. He continued to examine her, and then he stepped back. He explained that the doctor at the previous health clinic had been wrong too. Maria's symptoms did not line up with any kind of tropical disease he'd ever treated. In fact, this doctor was afraid Maria's symptoms were connected to another sickness entirely, and if he was even partially correct, they would need to move quickly. This could be a dangerous situation. The doctor asked her detailed questions about the past several days, and Maria shared everything she could remember. She could see the alarm spread across his face the more they talked. Maria felt a terrible wave of panic and nausea start to wash over her, and then she felt like she needed to tell him about the bag. So she explained that she had brought this bag and left it at the public health agency in hopes that they would analyze it. As soon as she said this, the doctor quickly excused himself and ran as fast as he could to the phone. He called a physician at the state's Department of the Environment. He tried to hide the rising panic in his voice as he explained the urgency of the situation and that action needed to be taken immediately. Both doctors agreed that the bag Maria brought to the public health office had to be examined as soon as possible to prevent the spread of what was making everyone sick. The doctor at the Department of the Environment knew a specialist named Walter Ferreira. Dr. Ferreira, who had no relation to Maria and her family, would be able to properly analyze the bag's contents. But because it was late in the evening, they wouldn't be able to contact him until the next day. Early the next morning, Dr. Ferreira was getting dressed when his phone rang. It was the doctor from the Department of the Environment calling. Dr. Ferreira paced anxiously as he learned what was going on. There was a huge crisis taking place in Goiânia, and he needed to act quickly. He scribbled down the address to the public health office where the bag was, and then ran out the door and went to a nearby office to grab some equipment. He hoped his colleague at the Department of the Environment was wrong about everything, because if he wasn't, that meant thousands of lives were now in danger. About an hour later, Dr. Ferreira arrived at the public health office. Before he entered the courtyard, he pulled a device out of a case. The device would reveal if their terrible suspicions were correct. He carefully switched on the piece of equipment, but right away it seemed like the device was malfunctioning. And no matter how much Dr. Ferreira struggled to adjust the equipment, it just wouldn't work. The readings were just so impossible that he assumed it had to be broken. Dr. Ferreira was frustrated. Now he would need to go back to his office and swap out this broken device for a new one. So he let the receptionist know he'd be back as soon as possible. Almost 2 hours later, Dr. Ferreira returned with a replacement piece of equipment. When he turned that one on, the exact same thing happened. The readings were impossible. He tried turning it on and off several times, but he just kept getting these totally incredible readings. After a few minutes, Dr. Ferreira was horrified to realize that he had been wrong. Both of these devices had been working perfectly fine, and that meant the reality of this situation was much, much worse. If this situation didn't get handled, the whole city of Goiânia could have a catastrophic health crisis on their hands, and maybe all of Brazil could have a health crisis on their hands. So Dr. Ferreira knew he needed to get to that bag. Dr. Ferreira ran inside the building and was met by the facility's director. Ferreira asked where this bag was, but the director explained that he had become concerned about the bag's contents, so he had called in the fire brigade for assistance. In fact, the firefighters were already there and were about to take the bag from the building's courtyard. Their plan was to dispose of it in a nearby stream. Dr. Ferreira ran into the courtyard and saw a group of firefighters surrounding the bag. He yelled for them to stop, and that if they threw it in the water, it would trigger a horrific disaster. He warned them not to touch it and insisted that everyone just evacuate the building. Once Dr. Ferreira was able to explain what was happening, the firefighters realized just how serious this situation was, and they helped him clear the area. But the day was far from over. Dr. Ferreira knew he needed to track down Maria and speak to her about the contents of this bag. He located her at a hospital, but her condition had now worsened to the point where she was just too weak to even talk. But she was able to instruct Dr. Ferreira to just go to her family's junkyard, where he would find her husband, and he could answer any questions the doctor might have. It was noon by the time Dr. Ferreira and his colleague got to Maria and Devaillier's scrapyard. When they arrived, they saw Devaillier working next to his garage. Dr. Ferreira introduced himself and tried to shake Devaillier's hand, but Devaillier politely refused, and then he showed them the inside of his hand, and there was this huge open sore on his palm. Dr. Ferreira looked at it and then immediately shot a look of worry at his colleague. The doctor knew this type of wound on Devaillier's hand could only be caused by one thing, and it was the thing that Dr. Ferreira feared the most. Devier told them that this whole situation began 11 days earlier on September 18th. That morning, around 10 a.m., a young man had stopped by their scrapyard and told him about some scrap metal he'd found and wanted to sell. He had never seen anything like it and thought it was valuable. Devier said he was interested and told the young man to bring it over. Later that day, the young man returned, now hauling something in a wheelbarrow. Inside this wheelbarrow were the disassembled pieces of a large metal contraption. There was also a small capsule shaped like an oversized thermos. Devier thought both items were made of stainless steel, which would earn him a nice profit. But after Devier examined the capsule more closely, he became even more excited. It was lined with lead, which was an even more valuable metal. Devier paid the man the equivalent of about $30 and brought his new purchases into his garage. He left them there before heading inside to eat dinner. Once he was done eating, he headed back to the garage to start extracting the lead. But when Devier opened back up the garage doors, he was amazed by what he now saw inside. A strange blue glow was now coming from the thermos-shaped capsule. Devier was a deeply spiritual man and thought he might have encountered something supernatural. He grabbed the metal capsule and called Maria into the garage so she could see it too. When Maria saw its unusual glow, she was just as mystified as Devier. They took a closer look and saw that the blue light was coming through a small window on the side of the capsule. The window looked like it had already been punctured with a screwdriver, probably by the young man who had just sold it to Devier. Maria thought there could be a priceless gemstone hidden inside, but Devier was sure that it was actually a holy relic that would bring blessings and good fortune to the family. Devier was determined to continue examining this object. So he poked around the small opening with a screwdriver and removed what appeared to be several small pellets of a glittery bluish powder. The pellets were part of a slightly bigger pile that still sat deep inside the capsule. For all Devier knew, this luminous powder could be worth thousands of dollars. It could change their lives in a way they'd never imagined. As Devier told the doctors of this discovery, he remembered how special he felt handling the powder, and he wanted his whole family to experience it. This was the good luck charm they shared at their big family dinner. Over the next few days, Devier shared his discovery with more family and friends and neighbors, and each time someone came over, he brought out the special glitter. Small groups of people gathered around the capsule and peered through the broken window to admire the glowing powder inside. Many touched the small pellets Devier had extracted. Seeing how excited everyone was about the powder made Devier determined to extract the rest of it from the capsule. So a friend came over and, using a screwdriver, helped him remove fragments from behind the glass window. Eventually, they did get it all out. The entire pile was small enough to fit in the palm of Devier's hand. Once all the powder had been extracted, Devier gave the capsule to 2 of his employees and asked them to melt it down for metal and sell it to a nearby scrapyard. Then he brought some of the powder to Maria, who in turn dusted it all over her pajamas and bed sheets. Devier gave a grain-sized fragment to his brother, the bus driver, who rubbed it on his hands before heading into work. And on his shift as a bus driver, he came into contact with dozens of people. Another one of Devier's brothers dipped his finger in the blue powder and traced a cross on his abdomen for divine protection. Maria's mother handled some of the powder while she was taking care of Maria, and then she too became ill. Around that same time, Devier had given some fragments to his brother Ivo, and later, Ivo's daughter, Leiji, played with the glittery crystals and rubbed them all over her hands and arms. And then immediately after doing that, she had eaten her egg sandwich and become ill right away. Devier also shared his good luck charm with several neighbors who began having symptoms as well. After Maria had spent days wondering what might have caused so many people to get sick so quickly, she finally realized they all had one thing in common. They all had come in contact with this mysterious blue powder. So, on the morning of September 28th, 10 days after buying this capsule, Maria told Devayer she was taking what was left of the powder and the capsule to the local health agency to be analyzed. She placed these remnants in a large cloth bag, then she headed out with one of Devayer's employees to retrieve the parts of the capsule that had been sold to the other scrapyards. She managed to collect most of it. Those were also placed in the bag that Maria brought to the public health office. The story confirmed Dr. Ferreira's worst fears. He asked Devayer about the young man who first sold him the capsule and where he'd gotten it. Devayer said he wasn't sure, but he thought it might have come from some sort of abandoned facility that was located nearby. Dr. Ferreira turned to his colleague and saw that the other doctor's face had now gone white, because he knew exactly where that capsule had come from. It was a clinic that had closed 2 years earlier, a cancer treatment clinic. The capsule had come from a radiation therapy machine, and the magical blue powder that was inside wasn't from a precious gemstone. The powder was a highly radioactive material called cesium-137. When properly contained in the capsule, the powder's destructive capabilities could be used for focused cancer treatments. But without that protective shell, the powder became one of the most lethal substances on Earth. Maria and the others were not suffering from a tropical disease or any of the other things that doctors first thought. They were experiencing massive radiation poisoning, and the lesions they had developed were radiation burns. The handful of powder that Devayer found was enough to make more than 200 people extremely ill and place thousands more in danger. Dr. Ferreira knew all this because he was a medical physicist, and the tool he had tried to use outside of the public health agency was a radiation detector. He thought both detectors were broken because they were making so much noise and their readings were so high they were literally off the charts. But the detectors were correct. They were reading such high levels of radiation in the vicinity of where this bag was that contained the powder that the federal government would have to get involved. And now that Dr. Ferreira had confirmed just how serious the situation had become, he contacted Brazil's Nuclear Energy Commission. Within a matter of hours, they started testing thousands of Goiânia's residents for radiation poisoning in the city's sports stadium. On the morning of September 30th, 13 days after Devayer bought the capsule, workers in hazmat suits arrived in the courtyard of the health agency to properly dispose of the bag that contained the radioactive material. The abandoned cancer clinic, where the blue powder was first discovered, was demolished as well. On October 23rd, Maria Ferreira finally died. Her niece, Leiji, also died on the same day. They were each buried in special fiberglass, lead-lined coffins to prevent radiation from leaking out. By the end of the month, Devayer's 2 young employees also died as a result of the exposure they had received when they melted down the capsule for Devayer. While Maria's husband, Devayer, survived the tragedy, he never mentally recovered. Devayer died in 1994, 7 years later. Thankfully, no one else died from the radiation exposure, but many others sustained amputations, severe burn scars, and lifelong medical conditions. The Goiânia incident remains one of history's deadliest disasters involving medical radiation. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, MrBallen. A quick reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Lauren DeLille. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Matthew Chilelli. Coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Natalie Bettendorf. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballen Studios, our producer is Alyssa Tomanang. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballen, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Our producer is Julie Magruder. Senior producers are Loredana Polivoda, Dave Schilling, and Matt Olmos. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Louie for Wondery. Hey, it's MrBallen here. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, then you should check out my other podcast, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries. Each week, I dive into some of the most bizarre, mind-bending medical stories you've ever heard. Cases that leave doctors scratching their heads, miraculous recoveries that defy logic, and strange medical mishaps that seem too wild to be real. These stories are more than just eerie. They are a reminder of how unpredictable and sometimes terrifying life can be. Up next is one of my recent favorites from the series. Whether you're new to MrBallen's Medical Mysteries or a longtime listener, I think you'll find it just as captivating as I did. If you like this content, make sure to follow MrBallen's Medical Mysteries on Amazon Music or wherever you get your podcasts. We put out new episodes every week, and each one dives into a bizarre, mind-bending medical mystery that will leave you questioning what you thought you knew about the human body. In the summer of 2020, a desperate father ran alongside a stretcher in the ICU of an Ohio hospital, holding his daughter's limp hand. She was on a ventilator and was about to be put into a medically induced coma. Just a few weeks earlier, she had been completely fine, but now she was inches from death. Her doctors had no idea what was wrong with her. All they knew was that whatever was going on, it had started when she began hearing a mysterious song. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm MrBallen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please change the follow button's alarm clock sound to the song Tiptoe Through the Tulips and set it for 3 a.m. every day. This week's story is called Rare Bird. It was past midnight in June of 2020 in Sandusky, Ohio, and 25-year-old Lauren Wells lay in her bed wide awake. She had to be up early for work and had been trying to fall asleep for hours, but all night long, the faint sound of music coming from her upstairs neighbors had made sleep impossible. The tune they kept playing was extremely irritating. Sometimes it was very generic sounding, like elevator music. Then it seemed to switch to some kind of strange experimental jazz. Lauren had just moved into her apartment and didn't want to cause any trouble with her new neighbors, but they clearly were not stopping anytime soon. So she finally climbed out of bed and grabbed her broom. She was just about to knock on the ceiling with her broom when the direction of the music suddenly changed. Now it sounded like it was coming from next door. Lauren shook her head in frustration. She didn't want to start a fight with the entire complex, so she climbed back into her bed and threw her pillow over her head. She could still hear the music, but eventually she drifted off to sleep. The next morning at 8 a.m., Lauren arrived at her job as a nursing home administrator. She had just been hired 2 months ago, and she was proud that she'd gotten this position at such a young age. Running the nursing home was Lauren's dream job. She loved interacting with the elderly residents and wanted to make a difference in their lives. So even though she was running on fumes at this point from a lack of sleep, Lauren pushed through the day, checking in on staff and residents, and running various meetings. Thankfully, it was a Friday, so Lauren had the weekend to look forward to. She and her friends were heading to one of the islands off of Lake Erie, which is one of the Great Lakes. Lauren hoped some time outdoors would help her regain some energy. And the weekend getaway was just what she needed. The sun was out, there was a gentle breeze over the lake, and the water was cool and refreshing. Lauren was excited to reconnect with her best friends, and on their first night out, they went out to dance and have some drinks. She forgot about work and her annoying neighbors and just enjoyed herself. But as the evening progressed, Lauren found herself using the bathroom more than usual, but she figured it was just because she was drinking. A little while later, when she was on the dance floor, she felt a sharp pain on her left side. The pain stayed with her the rest of the night. She thought it was menstrual cramps and did her best to ignore them. Nothing was going to stop her from having a fun weekend. And by the time she got home Sunday night, she was feeling better, just like she had hoped. But soon after Lauren stepped into her apartment, her good mood evaporated. Her neighbors were playing that annoying elevator music again. The faint melodies seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Lauren dropped her bags and shook her head. She wasn't going to let this upset her. It was late and she knew she needed to get some sleep. So she unpacked and got ready for bed. But just like before, it was impossible to relax with that music coming through the walls. She tossed and turned for hours until finally exhaustion overtook her. When Monday morning rolled around, Lauren was definitely not feeling well. She figured she was paying for her weekend of partying, so she tried to shake it off. She made herself a cup of coffee and got on the treadmill for her daily run. But she'd only been on the treadmill for a minute when once again she felt an intense pain in her left side and had to stop running. It almost felt like someone was punching her hard, but from the inside. This pain went far beyond menstrual cramps. She figured something else had to be going on. Lauren thought back to everything she did at Lake Erie. She wondered if she had pulled a muscle while she was out swimming. It didn't seem likely, but she couldn't think of anything else that would explain the pain. Lauren had no idea how she was going to get through the day, much less the week, but she didn't want to call in sick. She was still new to her job, and people were counting on her. So she slowly got dressed while wincing in pain and got ready for work. And as she did, she thought to herself, at least her neighbors weren't playing that god-awful music. Once Lauren arrived at work, she did her morning rounds and sat down at her desk to take care of some paperwork. But as hard as she tried, she just couldn't focus. There was something distracting her. It was that weird music she kept hearing in her apartment. It made no sense that the same music would be playing in the nursing home. Lauren looked around just to see if there were any speakers nearby, but there was none. She tried to ignore the disjointed melody, but it was impossible. It seemed like it was coming from everywhere. But then she realized something that made her heart start racing. If there really wasn't any music actually playing right now, that could only mean one thing. The music was only happening in her head. She wondered if she was going crazy, but before she jumped to any conclusions, Lauren thought of someone who might be able to help her. She had a friend who was an audiologist, which is a doctor that specializes in hearing. Lauren called her right away and explained what was going on. She described the strange, repetitive sound and said it was following her everywhere. Lauren's friend listened patiently, then told her that what she was describing sounded upsetting, but it actually wasn't uncommon. She promised that Lauren was not going crazy. She said that sometimes people can hear melodies in everyday noises, like busy traffic or the hum of air conditioners, and just like songs that get stuck in your head, these sounds can do the same thing. Since Lauren was clearly so tired, she was probably more susceptible to hearing these noises. Her friend was sure that once Lauren just got some quality sleep, this weird music she was hearing would go away. Lauren was relieved, but also frustrated. The music was actually the thing keeping her from sleeping in the first place. But she was glad to know that if she could just get some rest, maybe her life would go back to normal. As the week went by, Lauren did her best to stay relaxed, but the music in her head just would not stop, and it continued to make sleep nearly impossible. And so a few days after talking to her friend, Lauren again dragged herself to work, and as she headed down the hall toward her office, she noticed a new odd sensation. Her hands felt like they were covered in a thick layer of dirt, and they felt sticky too, almost as if a glue stick had melted in her palm. She kept scrubbing her hands with soap and hot water, but she couldn't get them to feel clean. Lauren was totally confused. She'd never felt anything like this before. And it wasn't long before that same sensation spread to her feet. Lauren felt like her socks were glued to her toes. At first, it was just a little bit irritating, but then it became totally unbearable. She started going barefoot at work, which helped a little bit. She realized it was weird, but she couldn't stand the thought of putting her shoes and socks back on. Lauren was afraid that there was a connection between her auditory hallucinations and now her hands and feet feeling dirty all the time. But she had no idea what that connection could be. Lauren's instinct was telling her to go see a doctor, but she imagined how ridiculous it would all sound. She hung on to what her friend, the audiologist, had told her about feeling better with some rest. And so Lauren convinced herself that this was the weekend she would finally get some sleep and all these problems would just finally go away. That Saturday night, more than 2 weeks after her strange symptoms had begun, Lauren climbed into bed exhausted. She tried to ignore the strange soundtrack playing in her head, her sticky hands and feet, and the dull pain still in her left side. She pulled the comforter up to her chin, and she tried to meditate, letting the sounds of birds outside her window lull her to sleep. But after a few minutes, Lauren's eyes flew open. She realized that the birds singing outside her window were seagulls. Seagulls live near water, and there was not an ocean or a lake anywhere near her. The seagulls got louder and louder, and finally sounded like they might just fly right into her room at any second. Lauren knew that no amount of rest was going to make them go away, because just like the music, these squawking seagulls were in her head. She couldn't wait any longer. She needed to see a doctor. Almost 500 miles away in Easton, Pennsylvania, Lauren's father, Brad, was sound asleep at home when his phone rang. He saw Lauren's name on the caller ID and felt his stomach tighten. She wouldn't be calling so late if something wasn't wrong. After he answered the phone, Lauren told him what had been going on for the past couple of weeks. She had reached the point where she was so worried about her symptoms that she was heading to the emergency room to get checked out. Brad could hear the panic in her voice, and that made him scared. He was fully awake now, calculating how long it would take him to drive to Ohio. He jumped out of bed and reached for his clothes, telling Lauren he was on his way, but she told him he should stay home. She wanted to see what the doctor had to say before he made such a long trip. Brad reluctantly agreed to hold off, but he told Lauren to call as soon as she had any answers. 30 minutes after talking to her father, Lauren arrived at the emergency room. She took a breath and then described her symptoms to the admissions nurse, expecting to get some strange looks. But the nurse just nodded and took some notes. Then Lauren was sent back to see a doctor who performed an exam and drew her blood. Lauren waited anxiously as they processed her results. And after a little while, the doctor approached Lauren's hospital bed. She searched his face, looking for any sign of concern, but his expression seemed totally relaxed. He told Lauren that her tests were completely normal. He didn't think anything was really wrong with her. As he spoke, he flipped through her chart and asked about her work. She explained she'd recently moved and started a new job. The doctor nodded and said he understood, and he said, Lauren, you're probably just stressed. And then he prescribed her some anti-anxiety medication, and he gave her an order to see a psychiatrist. Lauren was frustrated with the doctor's diagnosis, but he seemed to be certain there wasn't anything else going on with her. So Lauren left the ER feeling somewhat unsettled, and on the way home, she called her father, Brad. Lauren could always rely on him to be supportive and honest with her. She told him how annoyed she was that all these doctors just assumed she was stressed because of her new job. But she was thriving there and loved the new challenge. It didn't make sense to put the blame solely on stress. Her dad said he totally understood her frustration, but the doctors knew what they were doing. He asked Lauren to at least start taking the anti-anxiety medication. With any luck, they'd let her get some sleep, and then at that point, with a clear head, she could reassess her situation. Lauren was not convinced, but she promised her dad that she would try. Later that week, Lauren drove to work as usual. She'd been taking her anxiety medication, but so far, it really wasn't helping. She still heard all the mysterious music playing everywhere she went, and so she really wasn't getting more than an hour or two of sleep at night. She gulped down some strong black coffee, but nothing could cut through her brain fog. She'd been a zombie at work all week, often losing track of what she was supposed to be doing. Lauren turned into the parking lot, pulled into her parking spot, and then got out of her car, and as she walked towards the building, she left the engine running and her keys in the ignition, and her laptop and purse were still on the passenger seat. Lauren entered the conference room in a daze. She felt like she was moving in slow motion, and she barely registered the team of nurses who were already there for the weekly staff meeting. Lauren sat down at the table and tried to read the agenda, but the words looked like a jumble of hieroglyphics. At some point, Lauren tried to say something, but nothing came out of her mouth. She looked at the faces of her colleagues, who were now staring at her in confusion, and suddenly, Lauren realized she had no idea how she had gotten there or what she was supposed to do. The nurses who were at the meeting with Lauren could tell something was wrong with her. They helped Lauren lie down on a nearby sofa and took her blood pressure, which was extremely high. She could hear another nurse calling 911. Lauren tried not to panic, but the fear was overwhelming. Then her mind went totally blank. By the time the ambulance arrived, Lauren was starting to come out of her trance-like state. The fog that had been clouding her mind had lifted, and she felt more clear-headed than she had in a long time. She insisted that she did not need to go to the hospital, but the staff wouldn't hear of it. And so, after some gentle coaxing, they convinced Lauren to get in the ambulance. The paramedics took Lauren to a local hospital where doctors ran a series of tests. As she waited for the results, she felt surprisingly calm. She was so relaxed that she began texting her friends to come hang out with her in the hospital. She said she was having a great time. Lauren's friends were taken aback by these text messages. They knew what she was going through, and this just didn't sound like her at all. A little while later, Lauren's father, Brad, was busy at work when his cell phone rang. He'd been on edge the whole week, worrying about his daughter. When he saw it wasn't her number, he felt relieved. But then he realized the person calling him had an area code from Sandusky, the town where Lauren lived. Brad's stomach tightened as he answered. It was one of Lauren's friends. She told Brad that Lauren was in the hospital and that she was not doing well. This time, Brad didn't hesitate. He raced home, threw some clothes in a suitcase, and sped off to make the 7-hour drive to Sandusky. Meanwhile, Lauren was waiting at the hospital for more test results. One of her close friends, who had come to the ER, was sitting next to her. When the doctor came back to Lauren, he gave her some good news. Her test results had all come back negative, just like before. They couldn't explain what had happened to her at work, but physically she was fine and she could be discharged. Lauren thanked him, then she turned to her friend and said that it must have been another false alarm. But Lauren could tell her friend still looked worried. And deep in her heart, Lauren knew she wasn't okay, no matter what these tests said. Her symptoms might have temporarily gone away, but they were going to return, and as she thought about that, she began to feel this terrible dread come over her. Lauren asked the doctor if there was any other alternative to being discharged. The doctor hesitated, and then he said yes, there was, but it was drastic. Seven hours later, Brad finally arrived at the hospital in Sandusky, and he raced to the admissions desk. Just moments earlier, his daughter had called him with the stunning news that she was admitting herself into the psychiatric ward of the hospital. And so Brad, all he wanted to do was just get to his daughter. Once he entered the patient area, Brad was greeted by a doctor and brought to Lauren's room. But he was only allowed to see her through a shatterproof glass window on her locked door, and what he saw shook him to the core. Lauren was writhing on the floor, screaming and begging to be let out. She was trying to tear off her shirt. Food was splattered on the walls, and an empty tray and plate were upside down on the floor. Brad was stunned. Lauren had called him just a couple of hours earlier and seemed fairly clear-headed, and so he didn't understand how her condition could have changed so drastically. The doctor explained that he was giving Lauren medicine to treat schizophrenia, which is a serious mental disorder that causes people to hallucinate and experience delusions. They'd already started on her medication, but it would need time to take effect. Brad shook his head in disbelief. There was no history of mental illness in their family, and Lauren had always been so happy and well-adjusted. The doctor could only shrug. Schizophrenia did have a tendency to run in families, but it also struck out of the blue, usually in young adults anytime between their late teens and early 20s, and Lauren was 25. The diagnosis was terrifying. Brad was desperate to do something to help, but all he could do was wait for Lauren's medication to kick in. It was early in the morning when Brad left the hospital after Lauren had finally calmed down. He checked into a nearby hotel and sank into an exhausted sleep, thinking about his daughter and praying that she would be back to her normal self by the time he woke up. After sleeping for a few hours, Brad returned to the hospital, and when he got there, the nurse gave him a rundown of Lauren's condition. She said Lauren had begged the staff to use their hospital phone, and then when they said yes, she had called friends and relatives repeatedly, forgetting she'd already spoken with them. She'd also become very aggressive with the hospital staff. Brad insisted on going into his daughter's room, so they unlocked her door and he walked in softly, not wanting to scare her. Lauren was sitting on a rumpled bed staring into the distance. Her hair was disheveled and there were dark circles under her eyes. He almost didn't even recognize her. Brad struggled to stay calm as he sat down next to Lauren. He tried to comfort her and asked her if she needed anything, but she didn't respond. The medications she was on didn't seem to be working, but the doctor said it could take a while to kick in. Without anything else to hold on to, Brad clung on to that hope. Over the next few days, Brad anxiously waited for Lauren to improve as doctors tried different combinations of medications. But on the 5th night after Lauren was admitted to the psych ward, things got even worse. Brad had gone back to his hotel, and in a routine that had become too familiar, a phone call startled him awake. It was someone from the hospital. Lauren had experienced a massive seizure and was being transferred to the ICU for further testing. Brad ran to his car, and by the time he arrived at the ICU, Lauren was heavily sedated. He flagged down a doctor in the hall and bombarded her with questions, but it was clear that the doctor was just as much in the dark as he was. All she knew was that Lauren was in critical condition and they were trying to figure out what was wrong. Afterward, in the waiting room, Brad called friends and family to update them. He tried to piece together everything that had happened to her in the last several weeks, hunting for any clues that might explain her illness, but all he had was a long list of strange symptoms and events. Brad didn't know what to do, but he was desperate for answers, and so he began mentally going through his list of friends who might have some perspective that could be useful right now about Lauren. And as he did this, one name came up that he and Lauren both had in common: Ken Zemanek. Ken was the father of twin girls who were Lauren's best friends from childhood, and he was also a psychiatrist. And so Brad hoped Ken could provide some perspective about Lauren's mental state. When he got Ken on the phone, Brad was afraid that Ken would tell him the same things as all the other doctors, that it was possible Lauren had schizophrenia, or that Brad just needed to be patient and wait for more test results. But once Brad finished going through Lauren's extensive list of strange symptoms, Ken didn't say a word. After a long pause, he said that the hallucinations and mood swings did point to a mental issue. But what troubled Ken was the seizure. Schizophrenia couldn't have caused that to happen. Ken paused again, and then told Brad he did have another thought, one that could potentially explain everything that had been happening to Lauren. He described it as a, quote, rare bird, or extremely rare condition. He suggested that Brad ask Lauren's doctors to test her for this rare condition. Brad listened intently. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. After Brad hung up with Ken, Brad Googled anything he could find about this rare disease Ken had mentioned. And the more he read about it, the more convinced he became that it was what was happening to Lauren. Brad headed straight to the nurse's station and asked to speak with one of Lauren's doctors right away. For the first time since Lauren's nightmare had started, he felt a real glimmer of hope. The on-duty doctor arrived, and Brad told him about his conversation with Ken Zemanek, but the doctor was hesitant to test for it right away. The condition Brad described was incredibly unusual, and they needed to test for more common conditions first. Brad immediately tried speaking with another one of Lauren's doctors to see if maybe they would test for it, but that doctor said the same thing. They were going to test for common things first. And this doctor would say that in their entire career, they had never seen a patient with something that rare before. And so a parade of specialists marched in and out of Lauren's room, but every test they ran was inconclusive. As the hours ticked by, Brad's frustration grew. The next morning, Brad arrived at the hospital and headed straight to the ICU. As he walked down the hallway leading to Lauren's room, he heard a commotion of voices and the sound of beeping monitors. He ran into his daughter's room and saw a team of doctors hovering over Lauren. She was lying motionless on the bed and her eyes were closed. Brad stood there in shocked silence until a doctor noticed him and rushed over. He told Brad that Lauren's vital signs were dropping and they were working to get her stabilized. And so Brad needed to leave and go to the waiting area until the situation was under control. But Brad was sick of waiting in a medical twilight zone. His daughter was on the verge of death and they still had no idea what was wrong with her. He demanded they run the tests that he had requested about this rare illness. The doctor hesitated, but then nodded. He finally admitted that they were hitting a total brick wall and were at an absolute loss. But they were at a small community hospital, and so their resources were very limited to both test and treat Lauren for this rare condition if she were to have it. And so if Brad wanted to get her the help she needed, they'd have to transfer her to the Cleveland clinic, which was over an hour away. However, getting there was a huge risk. Lauren was so weak she could die on the transit. Brad was facing the biggest decision of his life, but he didn't hesitate. A few minutes later, Lauren was loaded into the back of an ambulance, headed for the Cleveland clinic. Brad followed behind in his car, praying his daughter could hold on just a little longer. When the ambulance finally arrived at the clinic, a medical team was waiting. Brad quickly parked his car and joined them as the team grabbed the gurney that Lauren was on and rushed her towards the entrance. Brad tried to stay calm as he watched them wheel her to the neurological ICU. Lauren's heartbeat barely registered, and she was having trouble breathing on her own. The doctors told Brad that her brain had also begun to swell, and so they needed to put her into a medically induced coma to help bring the swelling down. Lauren was given a strong sedative through an IV drip to put her into a state of unconsciousness. She was then hooked up to a ventilator that went into her mouth and down her throat to keep her breathing, and a feeding tube was inserted inside her nose and down into her stomach. Brad tried not to show how scared he was, but he knew Lauren was hanging on by a thread. Brad spent the next several hours anxiously pacing in the lobby of the ICU while the heads of several departments at the Cleveland Clinic teamed up in an attempt to save Lauren's life. Finally, one of Lauren's doctors walked in with the results of Lauren's newest round of tests. The doctor was incredulous. Brad and his good friend, Ken Zemanek, had been right. Lauren was sick with something that was so unheard of, most doctors would never think to even test for it. She had a disease called anti-NMDAR encephalitis. Anti-NMDAR is extremely rare, affecting only 1 out of 1.5 million people per year. It had only been identified 13 years earlier in 2007. The disease causes severe inflammation of the brain, which then results in hallucinations and a total psychotic breakdown. This explained almost all of Lauren's symptoms, like hearing the strange music and the seagulls and the sticky feelings on her hands and feet. But it turned out that NMDAR by itself wasn't what caused Lauren to get so sick. The doctor explained that the disease usually signified a deeper, even rarer underlying condition, which would have caused Lauren's other symptoms, like the pain in her side and the frequent need to urinate. Those symptoms were caused by a tumor in her ovary called a teratoma. Teratomas usually strike young women. This kind of tumor is made up of tissue from other parts of the body, like hair, muscle, nerve, organ, or bone. Normally, when the immune system recognizes a tumor in the body, it creates antibodies to try and kill it off. However, the specific type of antibodies formed from a teratoma can end up targeting more than just the tumor. They can also attack the brain and cause anti-NMDAR. In trying to defend her body against this tumor, Lauren's brain had accidentally attacked itself. Brad nearly collapsed from relief. They had a clear-cut answer for what Lauren was up against. It meant they weren't working in the dark. Now they just needed to get the tumor out. A surgeon removed the teratoma the next morning. It was 13 centimeters long, so more than 5 inches long. And unfortunately, it was malignant, which meant Lauren needed chemotherapy in order to fully recover. For the next 2 weeks, Lauren stayed in a medically induced coma. Once she was finally awakened, she couldn't remember anything that had happened to her. She had to relearn how to walk and how to talk, but day by day, she got stronger and was finally well enough to go home. 6 months later, Lauren got the news they'd all been hoping for. She was now officially cancer-free. After a full recovery, she went on to graduate from school and earned an advanced degree. Then, in April of 2022, she took a new job as executive director of a senior living facility. She never heard phantom elevator music or seagulls again. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, MrBallen. A quick reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Steve Chivers. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Matthew Chalelli. Coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak, Natalie Bettendorf, and Tasia Palaconda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballen Studios, our producer is Alyssa Tomanang. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballen, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Our producer is Julie Magruder. Senior producers are Loredana Polivoda, Dave Schilling, and Matt Olmos. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Louie for Wondery. Hey fans of the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious, Mr. Ballen here. Now, many of you may know I have a second podcast called MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where I tell stories of bizarre, unheard of diseases, miraculous recoveries, strange medical mishaps, unexplainable deaths, and everything in between. And some of these medical mysteries episodes stand out so much to me that I decided I'm going to start sharing them with you right here. The one I'm about to share with you is called It Moves. And I really like this episode because basically right from the start, the creep factor is through the roof because it involves a part of your body that just makes everybody really squeamish. And when you figure out what's found in that part of the person's body, man, it's going to make your skin crawl. But this episode is not memorable just because it's totally creepy. It's memorable because this could happen to anybody. Like, this episode is relatable, which is horrifying. And so after you listen to this episode, I'm convinced many of you will be hooked on MrBallen's Medical Mysteries if you're not already. You can listen to MrBallen's Medical Mysteries wherever you get your podcasts, but you can listen ad-free on Amazon Music or by joining Wondery Plus in the Wondery app or on Apple Podcasts. One summer afternoon in 2016, a young woman squeezed into the tiny bathroom on board a fishing vessel. She locked the door behind her and leaned in close to the mirror to get a good look at her face, in particular her left eye, which was disturbingly red. She used both hands to stretch the skin back around her eye, and the tissue along the edge of her eyelid looked totally strange. So she just ran a finger along it, and then suddenly something dislodged from her eye. It was the small sliver of fuzz, about the size and thickness of a carpet fiber. The woman leaned in closer to the mirror and delicately pinched this weird strand and pulled it away from her eye. She held it up to the bathroom light, trying to figure out what it was, and to her surprise, it was almost half an inch long. As she stood there wondering how on earth this weird piece of fiber had gotten wedged in her eye, something strange happened. The little strand began to move. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, the next time you're with the follow button at the beach, anytime they get up to go in the water, kick a little bit of sand into their open drink. This episode is called It Moves. 26-year-old Abby Beckley perched high in her saddle and spurred her horse into a gallop. She savored the feeling of the wind on her cheeks as she galloped across the pasture towards the stable. Abby had spent the first half of the summer of 2016 renting a room at a converted cattle ranch in Gold Beach, Oregon. She spent her days riding horses and exploring the coast. It was only a half hour north from where she grew up, so it was a familiar landscape. But being out in nature never got old to Abby. She tried to spend the majority of every summer outside soaking up the sunshine. This August afternoon was her last day at the cattle ranch. She was ready for a new adventure, and tomorrow she was traveling to Alaska to work as a deckhand on a commercial salmon fishing boat. She'd never been out to sea longer than a few days, but Abby was always game to expand her horizons and try new things. Abby pulled on the reins for the horse to stop, then she dismounted and walked the horse into the stable. Once it was in its stall, Abby latched the gate and then walked down the row of other stalls, saying her goodbyes to the other horses. At the end of the aisle was the ranch's one remaining cow, munching hay all alone. Abby gave the cow a little rub on her nose, then she closed the stable door and headed off for her next adventure in Alaska. The next day, Abby took 2 planes and a taxi before arriving in the small town of Craig, Alaska, where her boat was docked. As she walked down the street, she could tell she'd entered a whole new world. The woods on the mountainside were thick and unbroken. The peaks rising above her were snow-capped, even in summer. And the air was crisp in a way she'd never felt before. Abby headed down to the waterfront and saw her boat docked in the harbor. Her first thought was that it looked smaller than it did in the pictures she'd seen. But the crew members who greeted her were warm and welcoming, and one of them led Abby to her bunk and helped her get settled. She was happy to be there and excited for what lay ahead. The next morning, the whole crew had arrived, and once supplies were loaded, the fishing vessel pulled away from shore and headed across the bay towards the open ocean. Right away, it was time for Abby to get to work. She was paired with another young woman named Allison, who was a regular crew member who showed Abby how to work with the other deckhands to cast out the big weighted nets called seines. It was a tricky process. Abby had to help fling the enormous net into the waves with one hand while gripping a rope to drag it back in with the other hand. Also, the net tangled very easily and was surprisingly heavy once it got wet. Abby's first morning was exhausting. Waves kept splashing up on the deck, soaking her and making her shake with cold. Even though it was summer, the wind that whipped across the water had a bite to it. Over the next few days, Abby's mentor, Allison, taught her everything she could about working on a commercial fishing boat. Allison showed Abby how to sort the fish by weight, how to stack them neatly in coolers of ice for sale back on the mainland, how to swab the deck, how to clean the knives and hooks and nets, which were always getting soaked in fish blood and bait. And so Abby came to learn that life at sea was both messy and dangerous. But it was worth it. On Abby's first Friday night on the boat, the crew grilled a festive dinner on the deck and watched the sunset together. At that moment, Abby realized that there was nowhere else in the world she'd rather be. This was awesome. After dinner, Abby helped clean up in the kitchen, and then she flopped down on her bunk. Abby listened to the sound of the waves outside and started to nod off, but she was distracted by an odd itch in her left eye. She wondered if it was a grain of sand or maybe a fragment of barnacle from the nets. So she rolled out of bed, went down the hall to the bathroom, and splashed cold water on her face. Abby tried to blink to kind of clean her left eye. Then she patted her face dry and went back to her bunk. She needed to get some sleep. Tomorrow was going to be another very long day of work. The next morning, Abby's left eye was still bothering her, only now she had a headache too. She went back to the bathroom and looked at her eye again, and now she could see it was red and inflamed. Abby decided she would just ignore it for now and get on with her chores. There were fish to be caught. 5 days later, Abby stood on the deck trying to work through her discomfort. She still wasn't feeling any better. Her headaches had grown from mild to full-blown migraines, and even worse, her left eyelid was now starting to droop, which made it hard for her to open her eye all the way. At breakfast that morning, Abby's mentor, Allison, asked her if she was okay, and Abby said that she was uncomfortable, but what was going on with her was probably just a stubborn case of pink eye. Fortunately, their boat was scheduled to return to the town of Craig that afternoon for a short stay to offload fish, restock supplies, and give the crew some time off. Abby decided that it was time to face the facts here, that whatever was going on with her eye and her headache was likely not going to go away on its own. She needed medical intervention. So, once the boat pulled into the harbor, Abby helped tie it to the pier. Most of the crew went into town to buy supplies, do laundry, and enjoy a day on land, but Abby went back onto the boat and down the hall to the bathroom. Her eye was really hurting at this point, and so she wanted to look one more time before she went on land to go find a doctor. Abby went into the bathroom, locked the door behind her, took a deep breath, and then faced herself in the mirror. And when she saw her eye, she could tell it was in really bad shape. She couldn't imagine how she looked to her crewmates. Abby ran her finger along her eyelid to see if maybe she could find some foreign object in her eye that was causing so much irritation. And then a moment later, as she was kind of rubbing her finger around her eye, she actually felt something that was kind of small and thin, and she managed to pull it out of her eye. And when she did, Abby immediately breathed a sigh of relief. Now that she'd found whatever foreign object was in her eye, she thought maybe she would start to feel better. But when she got a good look at this thing she had pulled from her eye, she screamed. Pinched between her fingers, writhing around, was a half-inch long worm. Her first instinct was to throw it in the toilet. Her second was to throw up. Instead, she ran down the hall to Allison's door, barged inside, and showed her this worm she had pulled from her eye. Allison's jaw dropped. She told Abby that she'd worked on a lot of boats over the years and seen some strange things, but nothing like this. Allison asked if Abby had handled any infected-looking fish while cleaning the nets. Maybe this worm was actually some sort of maggot. But just the idea of finding fly larvae in her eye made Abby immediately sick to her stomach. And so she threw this little worm into Allison's trash can, then she sat on her bed and tried not to hyperventilate. Allison flipped open her computer and Googled salmon worms. Abby looked over her shoulder as they scanned the results. They existed, but there was no mention of them in connection with humans. Allison told Abby she really had to go see a doctor. The boat wasn't going back out to sea for 24 hours, so Abby had time. Hopefully there was some kind of medication they could give her. Abby went to the ship's galley where they kept a folder of emergency contacts and found the number of an urgent care clinic in town. Abby called, explained her situation, and then booked their next available appointment, which was early the next morning. Then Abby went back to her bunk and did her best not to totally freak out about the situation she was in. However, every time she began to doze off, something would wiggle around inside of her eye, and she'd bolt awake with her heart thumping. The next morning, Abby sat in the small clinic waiting area, tapping her feet nervously. She had arrived early after a terrible night's sleep. Her left eye was totally bloodshot and swollen, and her eyelid was drooping worse than ever. A few minutes later, the doctor called Abby into a treatment room, and right away, Abby told the doctor all about her horrifying symptoms over the past 5 days. The doctor nodded, but admitted he had not seen a case like hers before. The clinic had treated plenty of sailors and fishermen over the years who'd caught odd parasites out at sea, usually from handling old fish carcasses, but those typically affected the intestines, not the eyes. Abby was confused by this. How was it possible that she'd caught something that a local doctor in this area had never treated before? What had Abby done that was so different from the other fishermen? The doctor then had Abby lean back in a reclining chair and swiveled a bright light above her head. Abby squinted while the doctor held her left eye open and gently traced along its edge with a small tool. Then suddenly the doctor froze. Abby tensed as the doctor switched instruments, picking up a small set of tweezers, and then he leaned closer. Abby felt the doctor pluck something from her eye, and then slowly the doctor lifted it towards the light. It was another worm. This one was almost the size of a paperclip. When Abby saw it, she dug her nails into the armrests, totally repulsed. How many of these worms were in her eye? Abby moved to sit up, but the doctor held her down. They were not done. Minutes later, he'd rooted out another worm hiding beneath her eyelid. Abby's mind raced. Where had these worms come from? But even more importantly, why didn't the doctor know what they were or what they were capable of? What if some of these worms had burrowed deeper in towards her brain? Who knew what kind of damage they could cause? The doctor eventually slid his chair back, peeled off his gloves, and sighed deeply. He admitted Abby's situation seemed very serious, but he didn't have the equipment to determine what these creatures were or how to get rid of all of them. Abby's best bet was to fly home and see an eye specialist as soon as possible. Abby agreed, then she stood up, thanked the doctor, and headed back outside. She walked along the sleepy small-town streets in a blur, thinking through every worst-case scenario, from blindness to brain damage to death. She felt invaded, overwhelmed, and totally alone. Abby walked back to the dock and apologized to the captain, but she said she had to go home right now. Then she packed her things and booked the next flight to Oregon. The next afternoon, Abby landed in Portland, Oregon. She walked off the plane and took a taxi straight to the ophthalmology department of Oregon Health and Science University. Her stomach churned with worry, but it felt good to be back in her home state. Abby speed-walked into the huge modern medical complex, signed in, and then asked the nurse to please hurry. She checked her eye with her phone's camera. It was still totally blood red, very puffy, and her upper eyelid was drooping so much, Abby wondered how much longer she'd even be able to open her eye at all. Minutes later, the nurse called her name and took her back to a room where several eye specialists were waiting. Once Abby was in there, she explained each stage of what had happened to her. Her weeks on the boat, the worsening inflammation, all the worms she'd removed. They listened and nodded, while one of them jotted notes. When Abby finished, one of the doctors leaned forward and told her that he had some good news. This was likely nothing. He said that patients often come in thinking they have some sort of parasite or weird insect in their eye, but it was usually just mucus. Abby felt her blood rising. The doctor in Alaska did not pull mucus out of her eye. They were definitely worms. He had even sent them to a lab for analysis. The doctors in the room told Abby to lie back on an operating table. One of them pulled up a chair, clicked on a pen light, and shone it into her left eyeball. Abby steadied her breathing while he inspected her eye. A few minutes later, he clicked the light off and slid the chair back. There was nothing there. He suggested she must have interacted with something on the boat and then maybe touched her eye, but whatever worms she'd contracted were gone now. Abby pleaded with them to please wait a bit and try again. She'd gone to bed last night feeling worms moving around in her eye, so she knew they were still there. And so the doctors exchanged doubtful looks, but agreed to let Abby linger a bit longer since she'd come all the way from Alaska. They all got up and left Abby alone in the examining room. Abby sat there staring up at the ceiling, feeling more and more impatient. For once, she actually wanted the worms to be there. Finally, about half an hour later, she felt one squiggle under her eyelid. She shouted for the doctors who were out in the hallway. They dashed inside, peeled back her left eyelid, leaned in close, searching with the light, and then one of the doctors let out a startled shriek. Abby almost laughed. It obviously was not a good sign for experienced medical professionals to react this way, but at least they were seeing what she was seeing. The doctor removed the worm they just saw and placed it in a sterilized container for testing, and then continued examining Abby's left eye. Within minutes, they'd found another 2 worms. The doctors were buzzing. None of them had ever seen anything like this. They asked Abby loads of questions, but Abby mostly had questions of her own for them. Where had she caught these worms, and how could there be so many? Were they breeding and reproducing in her eye? How dangerous were they? And what if this was just the start of something much, much worse? But the doctors were almost as baffled as Abby, and they couldn't really answer her questions, leaving her feeling scared and frustrated. When the appointment was over, Abby left the building and sat in a patch of grass out front. She closed her eyes and tried to focus on the warmth of the sun, but she could still feel the worms moving beneath her eyelid. The following week, one of the world's leading parasite experts, Dr. Richard Bradbury, strode to the front desk of the CDC's headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. The receptionist handed Dr. Bradbury a package marked urgent. Back in his office, he opened up the package and spread the contents across his desk. There was a container with worms preserved in formaldehyde, along with a case report from a pathology clinic on the other side of the country. Parasites were his specialty, so Dr. Bradbury was used to being sent worms and other weird creatures in the mail. But right away, Dr. Bradbury could tell this was an unusual case. These were worms pulled from someone's eye. Dr. Bradbury knew of only one species that fit this description, a rare parasite known as the California eyeworm. It usually only infected smaller mammals like dogs, cats, or sheep, but every once in a while it found its way into humans. This was worrying. In smaller mammals, the worm's impact was sometimes mild, but occasionally the worms would lead to cysts or even blindness. But in a human, the potential harm from these worms was mostly unknown. Dr. Bradbury realized Abby might be in serious danger. He also worried that the condition might be contagious. Was it possible she had spread the worms to other people? If so, he needed to act fast. Dr. Bradbury lifted his pen to fill out the case file and write down that he believed it was a California eyeworm, but he hesitated. Alaska was a long way from California, and the California eyeworm really didn't infect humans most of the time. And so the doctor had this nagging feeling that maybe something different had invaded Abby's eye. Dr. Bradbury took the worm sample and crossed the campus to the laboratory. Using a small set of tongs, he placed one of the worms between two small squares of glass and then slid that under a microscope. Zooming in, he immediately saw that this was not a California eyeworm. This worm's mouth and genitalia were a different shape, and other body parts were in the wrong places. The longer Dr. Bradbury studied this worm, the more certain he became that this was something he'd never actually encountered before. Which left him wondering, what was this? He was a parasite specialist with decades of experience. If he couldn't identify it, who could? Dr. Bradbury consulted the CDC's massive reference collection, which included hundreds of obscure parasites from all around the world. Thumbing through one catalog after another, none of the worms on file matched the one he'd just seen at the lab. It was time-consuming, tedious work, but Dr. Bradbury had built his career on this kind of attention to detail. Going chronologically, Dr. Bradbury dug past the 50s, the 40s, and into the 30s, sifting through every documented parasite the CDC had in its files. His eyes were starting to glaze over when suddenly he stopped. His eyes froze on an unusual scientific drawing. It was dated 1928, and the accompanying text was in German, but the image looked remarkably similar to the sample he had seen under the microscope. The worm in the drawing was absolutely the same as the one from Abby Beckley's eye. But this worm had never been found in a human before, because it was a worm found only in cattle. It was called Thalassia gullosa. These worms live an extremely strange life. They live, mate, and procreate on the surface of a cow's eye. When they produce baby worms, the cow's eye oozes pus to protect itself. Then the flies that kind of hang around the cow step in the pus and drink up some of the baby worms. The baby worms then grow inside the fly until they get too big, and the fly vomits them out, usually into the eye of a different cow. That's how the disease spreads. But in Abby's case, a fly threw up baby worms into her left eye, and they had been living and growing there ever since. The next day, Abby sat in her apartment listening as the doctor from Oregon Health and Science University explained her diagnosis. She slumped back into her couch, totally repulsed. She was relieved they'd finally solved the mystery, but this was so gross. She thought back to the single cow that was on her summer ranch. Abby had often noticed how flies were always swarming all over the cow's eyeballs, but the cow didn't seem to mind or do anything about them. Abby would never think of that lonely old cow the same way again. Abby asked the doctor what the next step was, and the doctor said they had discussed the situation and had actually decided against sending her medicine. Anti-parasitic treatments would definitely kill these worms, but a dead worm might get stuck in Abby's eye and cause permanent scarring. The safest treatment was for Abby to remove the worms herself, one by one, for as long as it took. Abby groaned. This was not the happy ending she'd been hoping for. But she did it. Every time Abby felt a squirming feeling in her eye, she went to the mirror, leaned in, and then pulled the slimy little creature out of her eye with her fingers. Over the next couple of weeks, Abby would remove 8 more worms from her eye, and at that point it seemed like there were none left. In time, Abby would make a full recovery and she would enroll in college to study psychology. However, no matter who she meets, she rarely tells them that one of her claims to fame is being only the 11th person in North American history to be infected by these eyeworms. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, MrBallen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story, and also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Britt Brown. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Ryan Potesta. Coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Teja Palakonda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballen Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt. Script editing is by Scott Allen and Evan Allen. Our coordinating producer is Matub Zair. Executive producers are myself, MrBallen, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Senior producers are Loredana Palavoda and Dave Schilling. Senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Louie for Wondery.